Hello, Exploring Consciousness podcast listeners. Today we have with us a new friend of mine, Father Nathan Castle. And I'd like to welcome you to the show, Father Nathan.
Great to be with you, Donna.
So this is going to be a little different podcast. We are going to be talking about exploring consciousness with a Catholic priest. Father Castle is a Dominican. And because I'm a teacher and he is a teacher slash preacher, we're going to start with a PowerPoint. So for those that are just on audio, we're going to direct you over to the YouTube channel where you can see this. But kind of stay with us as we go through this outline. So as a teacher, I always like to have a PowerPoint for my students so they know where we are. And sometimes on the whiteboard, I'll write next to where we are, I'll put in parentheses, "You are here," like they do in the mall, directions in the mall. So
I really admire that. When I teach, I'd like to be you, but I'm never quite as organized as you, as this appears to be.
well, I'm a 30-year classroom teacher, so you can't
All right.
you can't quite get that out of me yet.
Right.
So,
All right.
and as a classroom teacher, we start with definitions. So I'm going to go through the first 5 bullet points for the audio people. So we're going to talk about definitions. Number 2, we're going to ask Father Nathan who he is. Who are you? 3, we're going to ask about his early life. 4, why the Dominicans? And then Catholic and Dominican mystic history. And within that, with who you are, we're going to talk a little bit about why he's here for exploring consciousness. So that's the screen. That's where we are. But I'm going to stop the sharing and just start talking. Here we go. Okay. Father Nathan, what is consciousness to you?
Well, I was just going to look the word up. I know I love etymology. You and I had a nice meal where we talked about etymology. And I know that co and con always means to be with. And I think the SCIE is related to science. Uh, it has to do with methodically observing things and trying to understand them. So the co and con means to do that together. So I guess consciousness is a way of using my cognitive powers to understand with you whatever it is we apply ourselves to, whatever the object of our thought is.
And
How would
also,
you, how would you describe that? How do you,
that's a great question for me. And consciousness would be awareness,
yeah,
not just going through life asleep or habitual,
yes,
doing things rotely
right.
over and over again, or living in the past. So for me, it's like being present, being in the here and now, and being aware.
And it's related to the word uh, 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 I'm stumbling over it, but
That's
uh,
why I'm a good editor. No one will know this.
okay. Conscience, like to have an act of or even like contrition. To have a conscience means to have moral thoughts about actions and to sometimes retrospectively think about what one has done or thought and challenge oneself to say, is this the way I want to think and act? And
Exactly.
perhaps I can learn from myself, and the next time I have that opportunity, I'll make another better choice.
And also part of what and for people to know, this is going to be a series. This isn't our only chat that we're going to have. That's why we also put the bullet points up so that you know where we are. And we're going to be talking about taking consciousness into surviving death. So having been a near-death experiencer, so some people would call me an NDE or an experiencer, that one of the first things that when I died and realized that I was dead was, oh, I'm here. I brought myself with me.
Yes,
So we're going to be talking about how consciousness survives physical death. That's
amen.
really important, right?
Yes, it certainly is. It's really kind of my main mission anymore is helping people understand that they're not just temporary beings. They're permanent beings. They're always going to be. And it's not necessary to feel limited as you age or circumstances change around you. There's just, you have unlimited potential and nothing can change that.
And that takes the pressure. I know for me, it took the pressure off of trying to get everything done in right now, that you continue.
Before the clock strikes 12 and you don't know what time it is. How are you
Yeah.
supposed to do that?
And it's a good thing too, and we can talk about time because time, you talk a lot about time with the stories of the people that you help. And so, time for me, with near death experiencers, it's really different for each person. And for me, there was no time. And I know in your stories, there are people that know exactly the time. So, time is really funny, isn't it?
It's all about what a person holds in their consciousness. And if people pay a lot of attention to time, well, then it has more impact on the way they think and act.
So let's talk about you as a Catholic. Like, why is a Catholic priest on the Exploring Consciousness podcast? What do you mean by Catholic? And how can you be a Catholic mystic? Do you consider yourself a mystic? Or what's that Catholicism all about?
Well, that's a lot of questions in one.
It is. I like to do that.
All right. Well, Catholic means universal. I have a graphic of myself on my website of me dressed in my full Dominican black and white habit, the robes that go all the way to the floor, and then me just standing in just black slacks and a black shirt back to back to each other. And so it's the same me, two images of me. And one of them is this Roman Catholic priest. And the word simply means universal. So when it's written with a lowercase c, it just means universal. It's a synonym for the word universal. When it has an uppercase c, it refers to the Roman Catholic Church. And I've been a member of that for my 65 years. My little dog friend needs to leave the room. Just a moment.
So we're going to put this on pause. The sound that you heard was the dog barking. And I
Yeah.
don't think I can take that out of the podcast.
That's all right. I have a little dog that is my friend's dog, and I'm over at his house. And anyway, he often accompanies me on Zoom. Anyway, back to I was born into a Catholic family, and I made the conscious choice to live my life as a Catholic with all the joys and sorrows that come with it. Um, I know a lot of people are former Catholic or whatever, and I sometimes find that that's sort of a ministry that I have now, is just helping people reappropriate pieces of their Catholic training that still have value, even though they might not be formally involved in a religious congregation or anything. I just believe I belong to the universe, and the universe belongs to me, and partly that gets moved through the Roman Catholic system, and some of that just is waking up as part of the whole universe.
So I loved your early life, and we're in his early life right now. He was born in Houston, Texas, in a Catholic family, one of 5 kids, and 2 aunts that were Dominicans. But I love what you talk about, how your mom taught you and what your training was. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, in fact, I grew up near Houston in a little town called Groves. It's actually about an hour and a half east on the Louisiana border. But yeah, I grew up in a Catholic home I was the third of 5 children, and my grandparents, my dad's parents, lived next door. They were active practicing Catholics, and my grandmother had mystic gifts that she walked around the house talking to Saint Anthony of Padua and Saint Joseph the carpenter. And late in her, when my parents built their dream home when I was 4 years old, and it was on the back lot of our previous home. And my grandparents moved into the house we moved out of as we moved into the larger one. And she just got time life books through the mail on how to rewire your house and how to build a bathroom in the garage. And she just would do anything, but she never did it alone. She would access whatever saint or angel, or Jesus taught her how to do oil painting. She would just say, "Sweet Jesus, take my hand, let's go," and she just do
Unbelievable.
stuff. So I grew up around that, and then my parents and my mom was a great little catechist of children. She taught me about God's presence in my life and how I had parents on earth and parents in heaven, and I could talk to at night before sleep, we would talk to my other family and thank them for the day or talk to them and so on. And she taught me how to prepare myself for sleep. She taught me how to give blessings to people. It was like giving a present to people. Sometimes you send them cards or gifts through the mail, but you can also do it with prayer. Prayer could move across space. So you could bless somebody and send them love that they would somehow get in some mysterious way. So I grew
I
up
love
praying
that.
for people that died too. You didn't have to be limited to people that were just alive right now. You could also do that for people that used to be alive on earth but now are alive differently. And maybe they still needed things and you could send them something that would help them.
And I love what your aunt took you aside as a young child and taught you the power of children's prayers.
Yeah, both of my aunts were first grade teachers. So they were, it was, you're a teacher. It was right in their heart then, and they really loved teaching first grade. They didn't always get to do what they wanted. When you were a nun, they told you what to do. And if they needed a fourth grade teacher, you became that. But they both really liked the low grades, especially first. And one of my aunts took me aside but right before my first communion, and said, "Now I need you to listen to this. This is really important. That God loves everybody, and God hears everybody's prayers. But the prayers of children goes directly to God's heart, and you won't be a child for very long. So don't waste your short childhood. While you're a child, pray for everything that you can think of." She didn't call it a superpower at the time, but that was the effect of it. She taught me that I had this capacity that maybe the adults didn't, but I wouldn't always have it. And so use it while you have it. So I was very busy as a child praying for everybody and everything.
So, podcast listeners, the reason why we're doing all this talking is because Father Nathan's life work is what people in the Monroe Institute would call lifelines, but a little different. So, people have come to him that were stuck in their death experience, and he has helped them based on his skills. So, we're telling you about his early life because, like my friend Candy Sanderson, who wrote The Reluctant Messenger, Father Nathan wrote a book about interrupted death experiences. But I think God, the universe, source, whichever bent you are listening, is that he prepared Nathan. He prepared him and his mother and his aunts. So his whole family, they were mystics. They still are very mystical people. And so they know about the other side, and he was taught about the other side. So it's, a lot of times in the podcast, people ask him, why were you chosen? But to me, it was a no-brainer that he's normal. He's got 2 feet on the earth, but his heart and his soul also are on the other side. And all this comes from that training. Wouldn't you agree with that, Father Nathan?
I would, except I wouldn't just stop at the other side. There is another side. I get that. But my mom also taught me that was inside me. That
Yes, yes.
like
Yep.
I'm looking at the background that you have behind you right now suggests the outer space and stuff. And I understood that there was outer space, but I understood that there was inner space too.
That's
And
why I have my T-shirt, my medicine bearer
okay,
T-shirt.
all right.
I wore
Uh,
that because there is inner space.
she taught me when I was still learning the alphabet. She would do my night prayers with me, and they were mostly repeat after me. She would say something and I would repeat it because that's what all I was capable of when I was that small. But she knew I was learning the alphabet, and she made me make the sign of the cross as we began a prayer, that we're not talking to everybody, we're talking to somebody. Uh, that's important for spiritual work because I just don't throw my consciousness out into the ether and talk to any passing spirit. I don't pick up hitchhikers. I speak specifically inside what I call the body of Christ in the light, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And my mom taught me that makes an X. And she knew that I liked pirates and had pirate books and pirate collectibles and so on. And she taught me that, she knew that I understood that X marks the spot of the buried treasure. You can't see the treasure because it's buried, but she taught me that my eyes are round, and when they're open in the daytime, they see what's in front of me, what's outside of me. And when I close them at night and go to sleep, I can see what's inside me, and that God is buried inside me, and that at night, God and I can talk even while I'm asleep, or God and I can at least be together while I'm asleep. And so I would consecrate my sleep, um, which is a monastic practice. The last prayer of the day in a monastery is called Compline, which
Compline.
essentially what my mom was teaching me was to hand my consciousness to God as an object and say, here, would you please hold on to my consciousness while I'm unconscious, and perhaps you'd like to do something with it.
I love that concept because we've always talked about on this podcast about exploring your own consciousness. And this is the first time that we really talked about. I love that your eyes are inside and looking inside of you, but also handing over your consciousness to God. In my near-death experience, I did exactly that. I handed over my beingness to God. And so as soon as I did that, I realized I couldn't take that back.
Yes.
And
It's
so,
really what people do at
very different.
weddings. You know,
Okay.
people take their whole self and publicly give it away to their beloved, um, and with the awareness that they could live a happy life as a single person, but love has changed them and their awareness in a way that they can hardly even imagine not being a part of this other person in a way that they just give themselves to.
So, we don't want to make assumptions here because your aunts were Dominican. Doesn't mean that you were going to be Dominican.
Oh
And
no.
for non Catholics, what that means is that most priests that we talk about are what they call diocesan priests, and they have their obedience or their vows to the bishop, the local bishop, and then to the cardinal, then to the pope. What's different about Father Nathan is that his is what we call an order, a holy order of Dominicans. Can you talk a little bit about Dominicans and why you chose them? I especially like what you said about joy.
Yeah, I was looking around. I went to a Presbyterian college after going through Catholic school through my childhood, and was scanning about for was I gonna. I knew that God and faith were important to me, and being in a faith body was. I wasn't absolutely sure I'd stay Catholic, but as I looked around at the possibilities, eventually I did decide to kind of bloom where I was planted. It seemed like my church needed, and we were drawing our leadership, priestly leadership, from such a small subset. Uh, Only men, only educable men, because it takes a lot of study, and men who are willing to make a celibate vow. It's a very small subset. And I looked at that. I kept praying, "Oh God, take me, I'm yours. Just don't make me be a priest. Amen."
I
That was
love
my,
that. I love that.
and then I got sick of hearing that. And I just thought, I'm either in or I'm not. And so I began to say, okay, I'll even do that if you'll help me, and if you'll make sure that I have a life full of love. I didn't want to be an old codger. I didn't want to be an old, mean, lonely guy. And I'm almost 66 now, and I'm not an old, mean codger.
Not even close.
I'm a
Not even
joyful
close.
man. When I looked around at the possibilities, and the Jesuits, many people, not even non-Catholics, would know of them. They almost make everybody get a PhD, and I just didn't want one. I wanted a more general education than the very focused way that the academy makes a person. I've been at graduations of PhD candidates, and when they're getting their diploma, their thesis topic is proclaimed, usually to laughter, because we all know that none of us could read that and know what it meant. It's so arcane that you'd have to be a specialist to even read it, and I didn't want that. Maybe that's unfair to any of your listeners who have PhDs, but that was my perception of it anyway. I wanted something more general. I wanted to be well educated, and I learned that the Dominicans were like the next level of higher education in the church, but that Dominic was known as the joyful friar. And I didn't want to join any order that had pain or suffering or blood in its name. There's a lot of them that are the little brothers of the crucified Christ, or the drops of blood dripping down the. There's all these ones that are about pain and suffering, and I just didn't want to build life around that. Life's hard enough as it is without making it your whole identity. So anyway, a joyful friar is what I wanted to be.
And you are a joyful friar. I love that. What I find is what's interesting to me is that even though I've talked about you being prepared and ready for this part of your life's work, I found that very interesting that you're such a joyful person, and you've been given such a trauma, people that have such trauma and violence and shooting and murders and of course for me drowning.
Yes.
I found that very interesting. Do you find that interesting?
Of course, I think people are interesting to begin with, but they're very interesting when they have a story of having died and gone out of body, and even you had a near death experience that
Mhm.
you survived, but I deal with people that actually did die, but their consciousness survived, and somehow they reach out to me for something they think I can assist with. Not just me, but with a prayer partner.
Right. And
These are always done with another or others.
we probably should, before we get into a lot of the stories, we're on bullet point number 5. We're talking about Dominican and Catholic mysticism. So maybe a lot of listeners equate Catholic priesthood and Catholic Catholicism with old, archaic, mean, spiteful, like you said, the orders of the blood of, just
Well, even those people,
nasty stuff.
there's nothing wrong with that. It just wasn't a good fit for me.
Wasn't a good fit. Right. But what is mysticism? And don't we have a long history of mysticism that people don't know about? That
Yeah, and even practicing Catholics rarely hear about it at the parish level.
right.
Uh, but we have a whole history. If you think about it, all the way back to if you know the story of Jesus's death and the brokenheartedness of those who followed him and loved him, many were brokenhearted because they just didn't have what it took to stay with him because they were afraid that they'd get killed. And so many of them kind of disappointed their beloved at the moment that he most needed them and had their own stories of that. But then he started showing up 3 days later. We call that Easter, and
Ah,
and he starts. He quite clearly died, but he wasn't dead. He was alive after death, and so those experiences started on like day one of the church, and they've persisted in all kinds of ways down through the centuries. And some saints are known in our age. Padre Pio is beloved of many people because he only died a few. Do you know what year he died in?
1968.
Okay. So I was in junior high when he died,
Gosh.
but he was famous then, as somebody that had lots of mystic gifts. And, as I said, people that aren't famous, like my grandmother did too. And the charismatic renewal hit the Catholic Church in 1968 or 67, something like that.
Something in
Uh,
that area, yes.
and people began to speak in tongues and manifest gifts of healing and prophecy and different things. And our local Catholic newspaper had a priest who was part of that movement and who experienced some of these things and wrote about it. And my grandmother clipped these out and pasted them into a little notebook because she finally felt validated that she wasn't crazy, that this was a legitimate Catholic thing that didn't have to be off to the side. And I was the grandchild that she could talk to about these things. All I did was listen because I didn't really know how to respond, but she had stories she wanted to tell, and I was the person who could hear them. And I lived next door. So when I went up to see her, sometimes she'd pull out her little notebook and I'd sit next to her and she would tell me her stories.
So we have a long history of being meditators and prophets, and we do prophecy and speaking with the dead without it being like Deuteronomy, the necromancers. It's different. We're not calling up a divination for fortune telling, or we're
No, and I'm not
on the
asking
other
for
side, right?
lottery numbers or anything like
Not.
that.
It's not doing that. So this is
No.
part of the consciousness that is that we have a long history of exploring consciousness, of being conscious, of being aware, like you said, bilocation and mystical gifts and prophecy. You call yourself your gifts too the gift of prophecy, and I would agree with that.
I do. Because I'm trying to stay a Catholic priest in good standing. I like being this. I avoid the words medium or channeler, each of which are benign, and I know plenty of nice mediums and channelers. It's just that those words have a resonance inside the Catholic Church that can be problematic. And I love words, and so do you. I just choose my words carefully, and
Yes.
I believe that St. Paul wrote a lot about the mystical gifts that were not for some rarefied group. They were manifest in normal Catholic or early Christian community. And I believe the work that I do, that I write about in these books, it belongs to the category of prophecy.
Yes, absolutely. I'm going to bullet point 6 for people. And that is, I know everybody wants me to get, I can feel everybody wants to get to the stories, but I really want people to know who you are and what this is all about.
And it's
So
your show. You get to do it the way you want.
well, there you go. So we're going to talk a little bit about what you had done before this, because you came into this, what people would say midlife. So you were doing stuff before that, and then you were working with college students. You had a college ministry,
Yes.
and you were involved on a national scale for nonprofit ministry, nonprofit fundraising in areas that we would call social justice. The social justice. So you lived this life. Can you talk a little bit about that part of your life? Do you want to
Yeah,
talk about?
I had a really transformative experience. I'm a member of IONS, International Association of Near-Death Studies, as you are, and I haven't had an NDE. But when you're at one of their conferences, they ask how many people in the room have had an NDE, and hands go up, maybe half the room, and then they say, and how many have had an STE, a spiritually transformative experience, and then more hands go up, including mine, because I haven't had a near-death, but I've had a number of spiritually transformative experiences that left me different in lasting ways than I was before they happened. And one of those happened for me at 18 on a retreat right before I was leaving home permanently. I was going off to college and never coming home as a resident of my parents' home. I was always a visitor. And I knew that was coming. They were giving me wings and I was going to use them to fly away. But I needed to resolve a problem with my dad. I'd quit talking to him except in polite banter, but I wouldn't let him into my heart because he had hurt me a few years earlier. And I just protected myself by shutting down inside to him. And I just knew that was inauthentic and I didn't want to leave on those terms, but I'd never spoken to him in meaningful ways ever. And I was one of 5 kids in a busy household. There wasn't a lot of one-on-one time with parents. Uh, and we liked each other, but I don't think I would say I loved him. I respected him, but I didn't really know him and he didn't really know me. And I was emerging into young adulthood and with that construct. And I just, on this retreat, I admitted that to people and felt ashamed that I didn't have the courage to go to him and tell him that he had hurt me and I shut down and here's why. And I'd like to change that. And when I told the truth, it was a Catholic retreat and they said, would anyone like to go to confession? And I felt like I just did that to a group. And now I could kind of make it official by telling a priest and receiving that sacrament, which I hadn't done in years. And when I did that and received absolution in the sacrament of confession, and then shortly after that, there was a Catholic Mass, which concluded this weekend. It was a 3-day retreat. And when I went to communion, all I did was take the communion wafers I had since first grade, which we believe is the presence of God coming to dwell inside oneself. I never didn't believe that. But that day, when I received the communion, I had my own Pentecost right inside my skin. It just, every cell in my body felt universal. Again, I'm looking at a picture of you on my Zoom screen with the cosmos behind you. And I just, in an instant, felt like I belonged in all of it. And it belonged in me. And I vibrated, I pulsed. I began to cry. And I was in public and I'm not a crier. But so I tried to force the tears down the inside of my cheeks, which I was good at. But they started coming down the outside. And I just thought, I must really look like a spectacle now. When I looked up, I had my eyes closed. I managed to get from where I received communion and back to where I came from and sit down on the floor. We were just seated on the floor in this kind of informal mass. But I shook and my palms got hot. And I knew in an instant that had to do with healing, that I was receiving a healing gift. Anyway, I went home and within a couple of hours later, I was knocking on my dad's bedroom door and waking him up. And I go into that in my first book that's about the Wizard of Oz and Toto too. That story is in that book. But so there were other experiences, but that was an STE. And
I love that you introduced STEs. We talked a little bit about with some other people about STEs, but they are spiritually transformative. And what's interesting for me, this is the first time I've heard you say this story, but you described my near-death experience. The beginning of my near-death experience was very much like that, where the feeling of vibration and the being part of the universe So yeah, you had an NDESTE kind of thing
That's
going
why I'm
on.
grateful that in ions I'm not an interloper because I haven't had an NDE. They make room, and I've heard that they might even try to change the name of the organization to reflect that. There's some talk about that, but
Yeah.
anyway, that yes, when these other things happened later in my life, they were preceded by a series of other things. I knew that I wasn't just this little isolated cell in the, walking around on the earth. I knew that that I belonged to the universe.
So I'm gonna skip. Um, I'm gonna skip to number 7, the retreat that started it all. So we've set the stage for the listeners and like who you are, where you come from, your beliefs, to a retreat that you were given up in Flagstaff. And so you're having this normal life and normal dreams, and Father Nathan, you know who you are. There's no doubt about that. And I don't know if it stems from your background, your 18-year-old STE. But all of a sudden you're dreaming, and talk about an interloper. Someone comes into your dream, and you're like, what?
Yeah, well, remember, I had the practice of in handing my consciousness to God before sleep, all the way from early childhood, and then it was reinforced in the semi-monastic community that I belong to. Our last prayer of the day is Compline, where we complete the day by handing our consciousness to God. Well, I'd done that night on retreat in the mountains of northern Arizona, and in somewhere around 3 o'clock in the morning, I was having a dream about finishing a round of golf with another priest and going into the bar for a drink after the round of golf, and finding that the bar was actually this location of a silent auction. Well, I've been in fundraising much of my life, running nonprofits. Silent auctions are one of the ways that that's done. And so I was looking at the little objects that were donated or whatever. And I looked across the room and saw on the wall a piece of framed art that was just horrible. It was before we had televisions that were on walls. But this was a piece of framed art. I said to my companion, look at that god awful thing. Who would give that to a charity? They should be ashamed. Whatever it was horrific. And I walked toward it because it was compelling, the way that we can't turn away when there's an accident on the freeway. We all
Yep.
slow down and looky loo. And even if it's awful, we just need to see it. And um, uh, maybe like this tornado coverage. We've just had these horrific tornadoes in Kentucky and Illinois and elsewhere. We just need to look at that stuff to try to take it in somehow. I was doing that, and the thing moved toward me, and then inside the frame, it began to play like a movie, and I began to be aware, even while I was still asleep, that pay attention. There's something unusual here, and it was in the scene. It was a close up of a young man sitting on the radiator of an old car from the late 50s or early 60s, the kind with fins and lots of chrome. He hadn't been in a collision. He caught fire while sitting on an engine. The hood was up, and he was sitting under the hood with his feet on the bumper. So it's an unusual thing to be doing to begin with. But that's what I saw. And he was screaming because he was dying in a fire. And he was angry at somebody outside the picture frame. And I woke up from it, like with my heart racing, and sat up and said, okay. I said a prayer, whoever you are, my name's Nathan. And I know that you were just sending me that. And I think I received it. And I said, whoever you are, don't leave just yet. Stay here. And I'm going to repeat to you what I just observed. And I hope I got what you were sending. But it was just really clear that it was not just my psychobabble. So I went back to sleep. And in the morning, I was on retreat. And on the retreat was a woman who was my friend, who I knew had unusual spiritual gifts that might come in handy in understanding what this was. So I just said to her, we had been prayer partners before and had unusual experiences in prayer. So I just said, would you mind, when we get a chance, let's find a private space and go off and pray for a little bit. We did that, and we were still for a while. And then she said, whoever this man is, he would really like to talk to you. Would it be okay if I allow him to? And she had the facility to allow her voice to be borrowed for a holy purpose, as I do. I didn't use that gift very much at the time, but she let him talk, and we met him. The first words that he spoke were, "Who the hell does he think he is, taking me just when my life was getting good?"
I love that you do Ray's accent too.
He was Georgian, and I'm Southeast Texas. I can put it on if I want to. And he just said, well, I said, well, my name is Nathan. This is my friend here for whom you're speaking, and we'll do whatever we can to help you. Um, who the hell does he think he is? And what we learned that he was 20 years old at his death. He had gotten his high school girlfriend pregnant. They married, and their child was about a year and a half old. He had formed a small business in a detached garage in the rented house that he was in. He and his buddy turned a garage into a little auto repair business. And on the day that he caught fire, he was wearing greasy clothing, and he doesn't know how it happened, but he caught fire, and he and his buddy had been having Sunday dinner that his wife had cooked, and the guy said something that uh, sounded sexually suggestive or in some way insulting to his wife, and they were young guys that took it outside, and they went over to the shop angry at each other, and somehow he caught fire in the while they were fighting each other, and he died.
And drinking, he was drinking too,
Yeah,
right?
they had had a little
So
too
that
much.
had, yeah. So that didn't help.
And that odd consciousness that comes with
Hmm.
being
Being drunk, yeah.
drunk. And so we just said, well, what can we okay, sorry that happened to you. How long ago? I said, I thought that would be an easy question. What year did you die? And he really had to struggle with it. We talked about time a little while
Yeah.
ago.
Yeah.
And he was able to come up with it, but he had to labor at it. And he said it was 1960. And I said, well, I was only 4 years old then. And now I was in my 40s, early 40s. So that's a long time. What have you been doing since then? And he said, nothing much. And I said, well, where are you? And he said, I don't know. Uh, but I said, well, okay, well, you found me. What motivated you? He hadn't been doing much of anything for 40 years. I said, why now? Why are you suddenly active? And he said, it's my wife. My wife. I've been watching her since I died. She remarried. She married up. She married her a lawyer and moved to South Carolina. And they didn't have any kids, but he did a fine job raising my son. I got no gripe with that man. But my wife is dying of cancer, and I want to greet her when she passes, but I can't the way I am. So he did a nice job of putting in a nutshell, answering the question of how can we help you. He was motivated to greet his wife when she died, but I can't the way I am.
But I
So I said,
can't
okay,
the way I am.
well
Yeah.
then somehow we have to help you figure out what's preventing that and help you become the version of yourself that would enable you to greet your wife. That's the task, isn't it? And so it took us about 3 weeks. We met for maybe about an hour at a time. There was no manual for how to do this. We just reasoned our way to what seemed. I just talked with him and listened, and I reminded him. I said, you're asking to now be in a hurry after 40 years of doing nothing. So pay attention. you're you've been doing nothing for a long time, and now you want to hurry, and that means I'm supposed to make you hurry, and you're not always going to like that. And anytime that you don't like what we're asking you to do, you're free to opt out. We're not the boss of you, but we'll do what we can.
Yeah, I love that. And
Yeah.
then it really speaks to also, it tells people that your loved ones they're not off into outer space or other galaxies. It's like the veil is very thin and they're right there. He's watching his wife.
People can do what they want to do, and
Yeah.
he didn't have to do that.
No.
He chose to keep track of his wife, and he learned how to do it. Um, he, but he also knew that she had cancer, and I reminded him. I said, "His name is Ray." I said, "Ray, remember, cancer has its own schedule, and it's not going to wait on you. Um, I'm gonna push you harder than I normally. You're sort of like a counseling thing, and oftentimes when I'm counseling somebody, I do it slow and steady, but I'm not going to do that this time because we have a deadline and we don't know when it is. So anyway, eventually, I asked him about God. Who the hell does he think he is? And I said, well, somebody must have taught you about God. How did you even learn that there is a God? And he said, well, my mom. And I said, well, tell me about that. Well, she used to make me kneel next to the bed and say prayers, and while I prayed, she beat me. I said, why the world would you beat a child that's praying? She said, I don't know. That's just what she did. And I said, well, would you have done that with your son? Had you lived longer, would you have beaten your son? He said, of course not. I said, well, then maybe, can you imagine that maybe you picked up a thing or two about God that was weird because your mother was
Beat you while
weird?
you're praying. Really?
And he didn't like that idea, but I said, well, just hold the thought that maybe you learned a thing or two about God that isn't true, but from the mom that beat you. Um, and then this business about God takes people, people die because God wanted them dead. Uh, you had a near death experience. Did you get tangled up in a rope and dragged behind a boat because God wanted to kill you?
No, no. I
That
got
was that
I
was
got
what he
tangled up in a
was.
rope because it's physics.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And
It
I
was
don't
an
know. He didn't
accident.
even know why he caught fire. And
Yeah.
I said, well, we don't even need to know that. It's just something that happened, and it's a thing that happened that caused your death. I'm sorry that you went through it. Wouldn't wish that on anybody, but that's not God's doing. Uh, I said, who taught you that? And he said, Brother James. I said, well, who was he? Well, he was our pastor. And I said, well, do you know what? I'm a pastor too, and I'm a Catholic priest. And he said, Catholic priest, shit. And I said, well, that's who you're talking to. And I just think he probably was doing the best he knew how, but I just think he was misinformed. In
I
fact,
love that. I love that. And I want to tell people that you've had over 350, how many now?
yeah,
Almost
closer to 400 of these.
400 people. There's 400 people that have come to Nathan, and they're not Catholic. They're everything. So
Some of them are,
it's really C, little C for Catholic Universal. That's why I laugh so hard at Ray saying, "Oh, Catholic priest." I'm
and
sorry.
then he said, shit.
Yeah.
Well, that's the truth. Yeah, that's just the
Oh,
truth. And
oh my God.
I'm the one helping you, and so let's just keep going. And eventually, we said it seems like we ought to at least get you moving because you've been stationary. It seemed like stuck. And I said, you haven't met anybody since you died? And he said, no. And I said, well, would you like to? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, let's think about this. I thought about his mom, but then I thought, no, not the woman that beat her child. Maybe let's save that for later.
Good choice on that,
What
Father.
about your dad? You never mentioned dad. And he said, well, he died when I was 10 and I was kind of afraid of him. And I said, well, and he said he died in the war. And I said, Vietnam? He said, no, Korea. And I thought, duh, 1960. I got my wars mixed up. He died in Korea. I said, well, uh, do
Oh,
what if we asked him to come and see you just so you could have a companion? Would you be afraid of that? And he said, no. And I said, well, can you tell me a time that you and your dad had a really good time together? That's just a little counseling technique. You might have used it somewhere along the line. When people go dark, you try to get them to elevate. Can you think of a really happy time that you and your dad had in those 10 years? He said, yeah, one time we went and looked at cars. I said, well, what if we asked your dad to come, but not too close so that you can see him, but he's not in your face? You get to decide whether he can come closer or not. And he said, oh, I could do that. So we said a prayer. I said, this is what I do, Ray. I'm not going to make a big deal of it, but we're going to say a prayer to God and say, would you, if he's available, if it's possible, could Ray's dad please show himself to Ray? And it took about 10 seconds. And he said, looky there. And I said, I can't see what you're seeing. What is it that you're seeing? And he said, well, it's my dad. And I said, well, does he look scary? Do you think you're being tricked? He said, no, it's just my dad. I said, well, do you feel safe maybe letting him take you someplace just so that you get around a little bit? Because remember, you want to travel, you want to be with your wife. We need to get you out of this little stuck space that you're in. So maybe your dad could take you somewhere just to get a little practice about what it feels like to move. And he said, I could do that. So we said, well, we're going to leave it at that. We'll meet up with you in a week or so and see how it went. So we did that. And when we got back together, first thing we asked was, Ray, how'd it go? You were going to be with your dad. And he said, yeah, we went and looked at cars. And I said, well, how did you do that? Your dad died in the early 50s. You died in the 60s. It's now almost 2000. How did you do it? Did you have to time travel? He said, no, we went and looked at the new ones. So somewhere on God's green earth, this it was such a guy thing. His father son pair that hadn't been together in years
wow.
and didn't know each other all that well met over looking at cars. And that was all it took for him to get unstuck. And then I'll try to make it short. We said, okay, now let's get back to the business of getting you ready to greet your wife. I said, I think I know part of what the problem is, and I don't think you're going to like it. And he said, what? I said, well, every time you talk about her, you sound like a caveman. you sound like you own the rights to her, that she's yours, and that you could just drag her by her hair into your cave. I said, think about it. She's in her 60s now. You died when you're both in your early 20s. She's known 40 years worth of people that you weren't around for. There's other people that love her. Her parents might have passed. Maybe some siblings have passed. There's going to be friends that have passed. I think that if there's a greeting party when your wife passes, you belong in it because you were one of only two husbands. You're the only dead one, and you're the only person with whom she had a child. That you should be in the front row, but I don't think it's going to be you all alone. I think you're going to be in a small group of people that want to see this lady when she passes. Could you tolerate that? Well, he hadn't thought of it that way, and he didn't really like it. But we said, just hold that thought that you belong, and all you really need to do is be a gentleman. Just be grateful for your place, but don't make it be all about you. How about that? Well, we left it at that, and then met up one last time about another week later. We were busy, and in case your listeners, viewers, think that when you have spiritual experiences, the rest of your life falls away, and you're outside of time, and you don't have to go to your class or cook dinner, or life still goes on. And we made room for Ray, but not at the expense of all of our other duties. She was a professor too, and she had a very full calendar. So did I, but we planned him into it. And when we met up the last time, we said, "Well, Ray, how'd it go? You were going to go, you were going to be with your dad." We looked at cars, and I said, but he led with big news. My wife passed. I said, "Oh my God, that is big news. Well, then what happened?" And he said, "Well, I got to be with her just the way you said." And it was kind of like you said, I wasn't the only one, but there were other people, but I got to be there, and that's what I wanted to do. And I said, "Well, good for you. You did it. You set out to do something, and you did the thing you wanted to do. I think our job is finished, so we're probably done with each other now." And I said, so it's sort of saying goodbye and I said, but I feel like you're kind of like a friend. And I wonder if you already know how to keep track of people on the earth before they die. And I said, would you mind just looking in on me once in a while? And when it's my time to pass, would you mind being a part of the greeting party? And he said, "Why, sir, I'd be most honored. Just look for the perfect gentleman." Isn't that sweet?
I love Ray's story. I love this, and this is one of 400 stories. But what the stuff that you guys learned? So you learned to be open to the people that are just stuck. You've talked about there's 7 billion of us on the planet, and we all die. And sometimes we die in groups, we die individually, and most people go on. Like I could have gone on in my near-death experience. It wasn't in the cards, I guess you could say. I came back, maybe just to have this interview, I don't know. But the point of it is that you talked about a small subset of people for the priesthood. This is a small subset of people that have died and got stuck. But it tells us a lot about what's going on.
Too. Not everybody dies abrupt, violent deaths either.
No, they're not dying. They're not dying violent deaths. They're not dying. But you're telling us about how to do this with, you have prayer partners and prayers. You don't pick up hitchhikers. There's so much that you told us about this process by just using Ray as an example. And we're going to tell more stories, but I love what you learned in this process, Father Nathan.
Yeah, it's a great adventure, and we were making our way, and we asked for the help of my guardian angel and Saint Michael, and I believe the Holy Spirit is wisdom, and it gives you what you can receive. We're both educators. You know that you can offer information to students, and they receive it according to their capacity. And
absolutely.
So we always ask to be made more and more deep or broad or something. The universe expands. I think when you're a universal person, you naturally expand, unless you resist it, which is something we can do. But yeah, anyway, we learned as we went along.
So this is a good place to stop this first half or this first series. But we just want to really lay the groundwork for everybody, because we have to talk about The Wizard of Oz. We have to talk about your books, your website. There's so much to talk about. When we went out, when we had dinner, you got to understand, folks, when we had dinner, most people would be like, okay, maybe we'll talk for 45 minutes. We talked for 3 hours, and it was really difficult to leave.
Yes.
It's like I kept saying, oh my God, I could talk to you for hours. There's so
Yeah,
much.
we kept talking about leaving and then didn't leave.
We didn't leave. And so we've got to do this. So thank you for listening, and please join us on the next series with Father Nathan Castle. And he trademarked the interrupted death experience, but there's more to it than that. But thank you, Father Nathan, for being here for this first one.
Okay, it's going to be fun to be back with you again whenever we do that.
Okay, welcome Exploring Consciousness podcast listeners. This is the second in a series of podcasts with Exploring Consciousness podcast with Father Nathan Castle. And we're exploring consciousness in a totally different way that's going to help you know that you're not alone. Even if, you're sitting in your room and you think you're alone, you are not. You're thinking about all kinds of things, and we're trying to open you up to possibilities of what's really reality. So let's continue with, we're in the story phase. We did a PowerPoint presentation in our first interview, and we're going to be on this one. I think it's number 9, or let's go back. Well, 8 and 9 are kind of the same. The interrupted death experience and some stories. I want to ask you a couple of questions on. I'm going to tell you the 3 questions, and then you can answer the way that you want. Okay, which story surprised you the most? Next one. And when I say story, I mean this is not a story. This is actually happening to you. What's the one that changed you the most? And what's your favorite? So surprised you the most, changed you the most, and is your favorite. And you can begin in any one of those you'd like.
Yeah, I'm going to confine myself to only stories that are in the public already.
Yes, please. Yeah, and talk about that. Why that? Why not any stories?
All of these stories are highly personal.
Yep.
And they have an element of counseling about them, helping people move toward a new resolution of their way of being. And they could be private. And unless I get permission from them to tell their story, I don't reveal them publicly. And that in the course of helping a person move, as we did with Ray, it's not the right time to stop in the middle of it and say, "Oh, can I put this in a book?"
No, not a good.
It's just inappropriate. It's an appropriate question to ask later, but not in the moment. And so I don't entertain myself with chatting up people who've died. But when I have an important purpose, I believe I can legitimately say in the Holy Spirit, "May I please speak to this person?" And then we ask, "May we use your story, tell it publicly, either in a book or on a podcast?" And almost always people say yes, but they also reveal to us without our asking, really, kind of what's new. What have they been doing since the last time, since we did help them with their crossing? So in answer to your question, I'm only going to consider the ones that I have permission to speak of.
So I hope people understand what he's saying. So in the beginning, he was just writing notes. He wasn't thinking about it being a book or anything. This was his ministry, his mission, and just wrote some notes like, "Am I hearing you right, Ray?" Using active listening techniques.
Yes.
Is it right? Am I hearing you right? And then before you know, I mean, this is like, he's been doing this for 23, 25 years now.
Yeah, and think about technology. I didn't have an email address at the time that the first one happened. I had a worker who used to call. I did have a computer, and she called it a big paperweight. I didn't know what to do with it.
So
It
he didn't know
sat on
how
the
to
end of
do
the
these
desk.
stories. So he's writing it down, not thinking that it's a book. So time has passed. People are coming. And then it came apparent that this should be a book because these stories, these adventures, not adventures, I'm going to take that out. But what happened in these people's life, and for me, the end game will be, what does this have to do for us now? How can we change? How can we live our lives differently? But at the time, he was going back and writing all this out. And when it became a book, he goes, I have to have, like HIPAA and FERPA, I have to have permission. That's when he went back. So many years could have gone by before he talked to Ray again and found out about the wife. So everybody understand that when he tells these stories.
Yes.
Thank you, Nathan.
Yeah. And I wish now I use an app on my phone that I just record our conversations. I get them transcribed into a Word document. Then I clean the document up a little bit, and then I store them. And I would like this to be. It could be somebody's research topic somewhere later if they wanted it to be. I'm trying to leave a good record of these experiences. And I was a social scientist by training. My undergraduate was sociology and social sciences. So I tried to observe and write down what I observed. And when I also know in the social sciences that you separate observation from commentary. And so I do that in my books. I first give the reader the raw material, and then I comment upon it, but I make it clear when I'm doing that. That another person might look at the same data and come to different conclusions than I do, and that would be their perfect right if they can, make a logical argument for doing so. Okay, you asked me a question about 5 minutes ago.
I did. I asked you a question. I three points to it. Because
Yeah.
it's good to recap. As a teacher, we do like to recap where we are. That's why the PowerPoint and everything. But which one surprised you the most? Which one changed you the most? And which one is your favorite? And again, their definitions, it's your favorite.
And if you ask me this tomorrow, I might have a completely different list.
Exactly.
Okay. Again, change me the most.
We can start there. That's one of them.
Well, it would probably be Ray because it was an introduction to this whole ministry. And then what happened after that is people started coming about at the rate of about once a week. So this wasn't just a one-off. It was a new vocation within a vocation. That's Catholic language. It just means calling. And it was happening while I was doing all my other work, but it kind of became my night job.
So it wasn't every day in the beginning. It wasn't like
Oh
Ray.
no, I couldn't have possibly
Done
made
that.
room for every day, but
And you
the
can,
Holy Spirit guided the process, and I learned that people didn't show up randomly in my dreams; they were vetted, that they were already being tended to by their guardian angel or other helpers in the afterlife or the body of Christ or whatever you want to call it. But they had reached a point where they were ready to make a movement that I and my prayer partners could assist with. I compared us to the discharge staff at a hospital, so maybe a social worker or somebody that helps you understand your medications, make sure that you have a follow-up plan, when your next appointment is, you have a ride home, somebody needs to cook for you. Our job was just to move people out the door of a process that had healed them to the point where they were now capable of a next level. So one that's really delightful to me is a young woman who fell out of a tree at 10 years old and died. And she said, "We're not dead, we're just bouncy." She was living in a place in the afterlife with other people who died by falls. She didn't know why she was there, except she needed to be somewhere, I suppose, and she landed in a place where everybody in it had died by falls. And she explained, she was very humble, and she said, "I'm not the smartest one here, and there's people that are older than me, and if somebody else wants to talk and take charge of this, go ahead, but I think I was asked." So this little 10-year-old was asked to be the spokesperson for a whole field full of people. She said, "All the people here feel like they're at the bottom because they fell and broke. And they all have a heaviness about them because they feel like they fell and broke." But what I try to tell them, they asked me, they told me, "There's somebody over there that's sad. Would you go over and keep them company?" So she was given work to do that was helpful, and she liked helping. And then she came to the idea, well, look, we don't have bones anymore. Look at our bodies. We don't have bones that would break, and we don't have blood that would leak. We're different than that. So if we fell now, we wouldn't die again. So she came up with the idea of, what if we taught them how to fall and enjoy falling? And so she thought of bouncy houses at birthday parties, that kids like to jump and fall and jump and fall, and it's really fun. And you could do that. You could just fall and have fun falling and see that it's. She at one point said they felt like they're like Humpty Dumpty with no one to put them back together again. But
Mhm.
they don't have to be like that. They could get used to falling. And she said, "Hey, everybody, you're not dead. You're just bouncy." And
I
so
love that.
that was a really sweet 10-year-old way of teaching people, come on, you don't have to be on the bottom broken. You can bounce. Come over here. Um, and then she also said that sometimes the grown-ups won't do something for themselves, but they'll do it for a child. And some of the people that had died had young children or grandchildren. And there were children here that didn't have parents who died in a fall. And she said, she'd say, would you go over there and help that one? And sometimes she said, old people will sometimes go on a ride at an amusement park only because they're with a kid. And
I
she
love
got
that.
them moving because they were with a kid. So she was resourceful and kind of entrepreneurial. I really liked meeting her.
What's interesting, it tells us a little bit about the landscape of the afterlife. I love that you say afterlife. And I love
Yeah.
that you say, you ask people, do you think you'll survive your death? So it tells us a little bit about the landscape for stuck people. And it has elements of movement or non movement. It's the stuckness is non movement. But when you're helping them, there's a movement and there's people that are there to help you, guardian angels, your relatives, loved ones. So people need to realize that what the afterlife might begin to look like. But again, we're describing the subset. Would you agree with that?
Yes, and there's many times they're individual stories that they're not grouped.
Okay.
Most of the time that's true. A lot of car crashes,
Oh.
a lot of people that died in a single fatality accident, or um, sometimes they've been murder victims,
Hmm.
um, drownings. You nearly drowned or did drown and
I
survived it
drowned. I
anyway.
drowned, and
Um,
only
well,
through the
anyway, a
grace
lot
of
of
God.
times they're individual stories, and we help them move through it. Most of the time, the story is about the day of their death and the events that caused it. Sometimes, though, there are things that happened earlier in a person's life where their spirit kind of
Yeah.
died,
Yeah.
where they went through something that was so heartbreaking that they were never the same afterwards, and they lived until their death at a much lower level.
I think about that woman that ran over the child, and I think about the baseball player.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
Yeah. Well, in my first book, there's a woman named Shelley that she was carpooling, but she was having some marital trouble, and she had begun to what she called tipple. She
typical.
was sipping the wine in the mid-afternoon as she was cooking, and then she and her husband would have a cocktail when he would come home, and it was a slippery slope of too much. And she was carpooling one day, and was she showed me in the dream a bouffant hairstyle that were so popular in the 60s. Women had
60s,
big
yeah. Yeah.
piles of hair with a lot of hairspray. She was like that, and I was in her eyes. I could see her. She was in a station wagon full of rambunctious kids, and she was trying to back up. She was looking through rambunctious children, and she hit something. Well, the thing she hit was a 5-year-old, and she killed it. Uh, and she was arrested on the spot. She was never back in her home ever again. Her husband divorced her, married somebody else. She did like 20 years in prison. And when she came out, she got a job in a motel. And one day she was flipping a mattress and threw her back out and was disabled. And then she sat in a window of a apartment looking at an asphalt parking lot and smoking until she died. She even had a neighbor do her grocery shopping and leave them at the door. She wouldn't even go out to grocery shop. She had just shut down, and then when she kind of hoped that it would all change when she died, like magic,
And does it?
and it didn't for her.
No.
She had quit engaging life at all and gotten that habit, and she found that in the afterlife, she was still required to exert, that she still needed to engage, and she had just gotten out of the habit. So she was allowed to work at her own pace, but they explained to her, no, sweetheart, it doesn't work quite that way. You're going to have to put forth a little effort, and we'll help you. and you choose the pace at which you move. They really like the fact that it's a non-judgment zone. Nobody's made to feel stupid, that they're not keeping up with the rest, or they ought to be doing it a different way, anything like that. Everybody's respected and allowed to move at their own pace, even if it's a snail's pace.
So even though this is a tragic story, it is a tragic story. It's giving us an idea of what's over there. And I think for
Well,
some people, it would be really healing for them now to know that they're about these kind of concepts. They're about non-judgmental, that they're people to help. And
that
as a
was
teacher, I
huge.
love that you're going to be helped and taught.
Yes, it's a huge school.
It's a
I
huge,
think of it as like a Montessori school where there's just everything around you and it's all fascinating. And you can pick it up and play with it and learn from it. One of my aunts ran a Montessori school late in life.
yeah.
She created one because she was tired of the Catholic school system that she had been taught in. And she thought, I'd really like to do it my own way. And she and her friend did that for the last 15, 20 years of their careers.
So listeners, if you're out there, know that there's aspects of this that are, look, if you got stuck, you made choices, you bring that consciousness with you.
You can get unstuck. And I've had the word stuck in the subtitle. There's two of these books. They're called Afterlife Interrupted, Helping Stuck Souls Cross Over. And in the second book, it looks almost identical to the first, except there's a big 2 on it because it's book 2. And we drew a red line through the word stuck because not all of them are stuck. Some of them are just in a place where they needed extra help because of the circumstances of their life at their passing. And you could well understand how somebody that died in a terroristic act might need a little extra help in the afterlife compared to somebody who died peacefully in their sleep. But
Yes.
it's all provided. Everything that one needs is provided. And then it's just a matter of taking up the help that's offered and moving forward.
So that you talked about Ray being the one that changed you because it changed the trajectory of your life. And
Yeah.
your favorite, that little 10-year-old, I love that little 10-year-old. Did you address the surprise? What surprised you?
Um, One that is still very much in my heart is Nadi, the
Naughty.
Muslim Muslim man. His story is in book 2. Uh, I felt like I was in Iraq or Afghanistan, somewhere in the Middle East where violence was prevalent. And in the dream, I was in a room that was windowless and dark, but there was gunfire outside, and I had to make a decision to stay safe or to venture out. And I ventured out into the street, and I saw that there were people bleeding and who had already been shot. And then over to my right, there was a young girl about 10 years old with a gun to her head, people standing over her, threatening to kill her and they gave her a machine gun, and she was to kill this man. And if she didn't, she and her sister and her mother would be killed. And I was shot. Um, and I woke up. And it turned out that Nadi was he said he was not an imam, but because of the war, so many things were not organized the way they normally would be. He was an elder, and so he became a prayer leader of one of the facets of Islam. But he said, to these people, I was the wrong kind of Muslim, Sunni or Shia, or there was religious violence because he was infidel. And the men and the women don't pray in the same space. So their mosque had been bombed and destroyed. And so they had to find an alternative site in which to pray. They chose something that had been a warehouse because it didn't have windows and they felt safer in it. But that was for the men. The women were across the street at an adjacent building and they were attacked. And so do you stay in safety and let the women in your life be the subject of terror, or go into the street? And he chose to go into the street, and that's where he died. Well, in explaining things to me, well, he was very surprised that he was dealing with a Christian, an American, and a priest, because he had never met one. And I said, well, here we are, and how can we help you? And he just needed to work his way through the violent end that had happened to him. but he was really pretty resilient. A lot of times their guardian angels help. We haven't really touched upon that.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's go ahead and use that.
Well, I was taught from childhood that I'm not here alone, that I have my guardian angel with me at all times. And that I've always operated under that presumption, although for a number of years I paid it little attention. But then after that experience that I related in the previous show of at a retreat when I was 18 and the universe kind of opened up to me, I circled back around to that and began to pay a little attention to what it might mean to have an angel that was always with me and was at my service. So in these dreams, they're still in dream language, which is representational. Uh, when you have a dream, it can this symbolize this or that,
A metaphor, a symbol, it's very
and then
difficult.
sometimes when they're in a group, like Nadi died in a group, I want to know: are we helping one person cross today? Or are we helping more than one? Am I in a foreign country today? He was surprised that he could speak English because he'd never learned it. But I've run across that. He says, all you have to do is think in the manner that you've always thought, and it comes out in the language that the person needs to hear. And he loved that. But we asked his guardian to come through, and his guardian did and explained a little bit of what was going on. And then one thing you ever been in a mosque?
I have not ever been in a mosque.
Well, you must have at least seen pictures of them, and you know that
Correct.
in
Yes.
Islam,
Yes.
it's considered idolatrous to draw human or angelic figures that look human-like. And mosques are decorated with colorful patterns of mosaics. So they're colorful, but not with statuary like a Catholic church would be. Anyway, he learned that he was surrounded by angels, and that's what the mosaics were in their art. That they didn't look like Christian angels or Jewish angels, but they were the presence of the beings of light that were full of color.
Mm.
And then he asked me if I knew a kaleidoscope. Do you remember having a kaleidoscope, a little toy that you look into it and you turn it at the end, and it has mirrors that refract the colors?
My
Uh,
friend calls me a living kaleidoscope
all right, well, that's a lovely thing. All right, maybe I'll start calling you that.
because of all the stuff I've done in my life.
Well, sure, yeah. Anyway, he said
Anyway,
I understand now that they were static bits of stone, but now I see them as movement and color, and and they can change. Anyway, he was talking about the angels, and then he said, as he was crossing, he said, we asked permission to use his story, as we always do.
yes.
And he told us in the permission asking that he was saying to my sister who was helping me, he said, I've become a student of your brother's work, and I would like to be engaged in it if there's a way that I could help. So
How
uh,
lovely. How
isn't
lovely.
it lovely? And he's since come back a few times to help, especially Muslim people.
Yes.
And when it was time to cross, that one did involve a group. And when they involve a group, it's never sure at the front end who's going to
Yeah.
decide that today's my day and I'm going to go. And sometimes they need some sort of conveyance. They need a ride in a car, or sometimes they just go for a walk, but sometimes they go for a hay ride, or they do something, and one horse open sleigh. Whatever. There's all these different ways in which they move when it's time to move. People show up for them. And in this one, it was a parade of floats. He said, remember, we live between the two big rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. And most of our people, we had festivals that were about water because we wouldn't have been able to live in that region were it not for these rivers. And so he said our festivals very often were seasonal about what crop was coming in and so on, but we had these festivals that were about water and joy. And he said when it was time to cross, it was a parade of floats. It was like they were all standing in about a foot of water, and these floats just could float around them. And he said each one is seeing on a float a person who would be attracted to them inviting them to get aboard. And everybody was seeing somebody different. He saw his father, and his father was saying, please come aboard. And he said, at the back of them, there's something like steps for people that don't feel like they can move or can't climb, like an older person trying to get on or off a boat. Maybe you need to help them in and out. He said, they're all moving slowly and they're not demanding that you get aboard, but if you want to, you can. And then they floated away. But then later he came back to say he'd like to help with this work. And he's shown up a couple of times since. And we kind of wave at each other. And I look forward to knowing him after I pass. But for right now, we're busy doing whatever it is we do.
The next thing I want to talk to you about before I talk about The Wizard of Oz, because that needs its own space. But before that, I want to talk about celebrity.
Yeah.
So there's also celebrities involved in the work that you do.
Yeah.
And I guess my questions are, how do you feel? So I'd like to ask multiple questions. See how good you are, Nathan. See if you can keep up. Okay, so how do you feel when you see a celebrity? How do they feel? How are they helping? What is that whole milieu about?
Well, one of the things that's really fun about this aspect of my life is that living celebrities won't return your phone call.
You don't even get to know their phone number.
No, and I've tried, and most of them have, all kind of walls around them that they're too busy. But in the afterlife, you often, it's not summoning or demanding anybody,
No.
but you can say, may I please speak with so-and-so? And very often they arrive and are kindly and disposed to help if they can. And I again, I don't want your listeners to know, I don't just entertain myself or amuse myself with idle chat with people that have died, even celebrities. I only do that when I believe it's at the service of the kingdom of God, when it's helping.
Yeah, that's why I asked you in terms of how do they feel in the service that they do. And I want to bring up a person I'm working with right now, who I do have permission, but not their name. I'm a sports medicine acupuncturist, and I'm working with an ALS patient. That's all I'll say about that.
Oh, okay.
What's interesting is that when you and I were talking before, and you told me, when I was telling you about some of the work I do, you said, well, I talked to Lou Gehrig last night. That fascinated me. So I'm hoping that Lou Gehrig is helping out. And I don't know if you can talk a little bit about what
I can talk a little. I don't have broad permission for that one.
Right. So
but I don't mind talking, in a broader way that doesn't disclose too much.
Right.
But yeah, there was one. This one was back. It was in October because it was during the baseball playoffs. I remember. Yep. And my mom was a great Houston Astros fan, and so am I. And she's passed in 2012. Well, anyway, we were helping a man that died of ALS. And no, he didn't. It's a dream. It was a baseball dream. And I hit a home run that won the game. It was a walk-off, a ninth inning home run. And it was a home game, so the home crowd was excited. And I was circling the bases, and I looked to where the ball went out of the stands. Yeah. There was something weird happening in the stands, and I finished running the bases, and it was clear that there was something awful out in the stands. And the announcer came on. It was somewhere in the 30s, I think, or 40s, and
the 1930s and 1940s. This was
but there was a PA system, and at the stadium, the person said, "There's been a tragic accident. The ball that left the field hit a child, a baby, and would you?" Both teams came out onto the diamond and said a prayer. They were trying, it was long before cell phones, but they were trying to revive the child and get them medical help and so on, but the child died. And the player was among those who were praying for this tragedy. And he said, the bat that I used was at my feet. And he was 24 years old. And he said, that day I shut down. I hardly knew anybody that wasn't in baseball. He was in minor league baseball trying to climb the ladder. He didn't have time for other relationships. He was on those bus rides from stadium to stadium. And he said, He said, when I left baseball, I left everybody I knew and everything I loved. And then he said, all I wanted to do was crawl in a hole and die. So I became a coal miner.
Mm.
And then I could crawl in a hole every day. And then when I came out of it, I'd crawl into the bottle. He
Mm.
became an alcoholic. And he said, that's the way I lived until I died. And then when we got with him, he said, well, except you showed in my dream that means that you've been moving, even if it feels really slow, and you're ready for a major move. What might that be like, do you think? Are you ready to re-engage and not it? And one of the things, other than we talked earlier about non-judgment, the other one is truth. And
Mm.
as a Christian, Jesus describes himself, I am the way, the truth, and the life. You can't live in the afterlife that I've seen and live falsehood. It has to be clear and true. And if there was something that you were concealing because it was shameful or you were afraid or something like that, well, you're not jolted into forced to live in a truth, but you're just, it's explained to you that if you continue to be that, to insist on being this way, you'll make no progress. And we want you to be happier. And so we'll help you step by step move toward your truth if you're willing to receive assistance. So he wasn't for the longest time, but then eventually he began to kind of melt on it. And the truth that he wouldn't receive is that it's not my fault that that child died. He just blamed himself, and that became his identity and his curse when it was an accident all along. But he just wouldn't hear it. Do you know anybody like that who's just living some falsehood and it's my story and I'm sticking to it?
Yeah, and it's funny because the one that comes to mind is a professional baseball player that I worked with who was very similar to this situation where it was a foul ball, it wasn't at the end of the game, and it hit a child. And
Uh,
yeah,
well, he had to eventually come to terms with the truth.
yeah.
And the partner that I was working with that day was actually a married couple, but the guy was doing much of the talking, and he had been a baseball player, mostly through childhood, all the different, little
Yeah.
league, pony league,
Yeah.
up as he got older, and then he was in some sort of semi-pro thing as a young adult. Um, and we were talking baseball the night before. We were sitting outside, looking at the stars and having a drink, and he was regaling me with stories of his baseball career. And then the next day, it turned out when we were helping somebody that it involved baseball. So he was really good, and he said to this guy, you all you you're lying to yourself. All you did was swing a bat and hit a ball and win a game, and then it had this terrible consequence. When are you going to just say that that's the truth? And you're not being a very good teammate
That's a
by
good one. Yeah.
isolating yourself. There's lots of people that would like to be a part of your team if you let them, but you're not letting them. So this guy was really insightful, and he was the key that turned the lock. And so he was ready to move, and when it came time to move, the guy that was helping him said, "I think you need Lou Gehrig." um, that he could just tell the truth, that a terrible thing has happened to me, but I'm still the luckiest man alive. That's what he said in in that
Famous.
famous interview. And as sometimes happens, that famous person manifest and wanted to speak. And so I let Lou Gehrig speak, and he didn't speak for too long, but it was that famous scene in Yankee Stadium where he told the truth of his illness, and um, he invited this man up to the mic and said, "I want you to come up here and tell these people what you need to tell them." And he said he didn't really pay attention to it until that time. The stands were full of people who had tried to help him since the tragic day. And he apologized to them for making life harder for them, for being unresponsive to their attempts to help him. And he said, the truth is, it was an accident. I didn't kill a child. I hit a ball, and it, and and that was all he needed to do. He just needed to tell the truth. And then he was ready to move. And then here's the best part of the story for me. Um, he said there's kids that have won a contest that are going to get to walk me out there to that microphone to tell the truth on the pitcher's mound. And if I don't go and do it, I'm going to disappoint these kids. You know how sometimes there'll be contests of you get to throw out the first pitch or you get to do something. These children had won a contest and they were all dressed up in little uniforms. And he said, if I don't do this now, they're going to be disappointed, and I can't do that to children. So that they figured a way to get him out there, and he got to the mound, and Lou Gehrig introduced him and said, here he is, and he has something to tell you. And then at the end of the story, it was time for him to leave the field, and my mother showed up. She was a fan of the New Orleans Zephyrs during the 40s. She lived in Philadelphia for a time and was a Phillies fan. And when the Houston Colt 45s franchise came to Houston when I was 6 years old, they became the Astros 3 years later. When the Astrodome was built. My mom was a massive baseball fan. I never phoned her during a game because she'd be too distracted. She'd be saying, "Oh, he shouldn't have swung at that. Oh, run, 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 run." And she'd get the feed. I'd be listening to the game, but she'd get it 6 seconds before I would. And so you just never called mom during a baseball game. And there she was walking this guy back to the dugout.
I love that, and that's a great way to answer the question about celebrity, because it's not entertainment anymore. It's about helping. It's about human beings, isn't it?
And once in a while, I'd say to people, we need somebody to come and help you. Have you thought of who you might like? And many times they have, but earlier on, years ago, that they often hadn't thought about it. And as it's evolved now, it seems like they're coached ahead of time. He's going to ask you this question, so be ready with the answer.
Because remember, they're vetted, so they're being
Yeah,
told.
and so
Who
now
Nathan is.
they pretty much arrive ready with somebody in mind. And this one guy said, "You said it could be anybody, right?" It was this guy Eric who died. He was kind of a nerdy student. He was in a gap year between finishing his undergraduate and starting what he hoped would be a program that would take him through a PhD. He said, "I didn't want that clunkiness of doing this degree and that degree and that degree." He was looking, and universities are doing more of this, where they're helping people craft an arc of
the bridge programs that they're
yes,
doing.
but without necessarily stopping to do everybody's everything along the way, creating a pathway. He was interested in that, but he said, I couldn't find any one thing. They all were too clunky. I was waiting to find my way forward, but I died during that year. And he wanted to study cosmology, but he wasn't religious. He wanted to study the kind of things that your viewers and listeners would love. He wanted something that studied everything, but he didn't know how do you do that. But he was looking for a way to study everything. And so when it came time for him to cross, he said, "Did you say it could be anybody?" I said, "Well, yeah, theoretically, we're going to do, we can't summon, we're just going to invite." And he said, "Well, then I want Einstein." So I said, "All righty then, Professor Einstein, you've been invited. Would you?" And so we stopped and said a prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. May we speak to Albert Einstein, and he came through. But when he did, he showed himself to me. This doesn't always happen, but he showed himself to me and to Eric at the same time. And he wasn't the old man with the shocking white hair sticking out all over the place. He was this tweedy young professor, the way he might have looked when he was 30 and just starting out. And he did that on purpose because Eric was 24 and he wanted to feel like an older brother mentor rather than some world-renowned expert. He wanted to be approachable and friendly and not too distant in age. So he crafted that particular way of appearing to Eric. Yeah.
Great way to end this particular segment. And again, there's so much more. I want to thank you, Father Nathan, for sharing the stories with us. And we're looking forward to our next in this series, number 3, with Father Nathan Castle.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, I don't know what your time's like, but what the next part will be, we have
just
to talk
a little
about.
bathroom break, and I'm ready for another story.
Ready for another one? Okay.
Yeah.
5 minutes?
A little break.
All right. get that later. Okay.
You about ready?
Yep.
All right.
Thank you for this time.
Well, I'm happy to be in a season now where I'm, when I was meeting with you, I was going to do a retreat the following day,
Right.
and I did that, and then that was my last retreat for a while,
Wow.
and now I'm taking this course from the Canfield group from Jack Canfield.
Okay.
He does Chicken Soup for the Soul.
Right. Right.
Uh, and it's a 6-month mentoring or kind of organizing your life or reimagining what you're doing. And as you know, I want to start a podcast. So
Right. So
I
a
have
friend
to
of yours gave you a book on how to start a podcast.
exactly. I haven't done anything with it yet, but
It's okay.
it's,
It's a
well, I
resource.
have the leisure. I want like this afternoon. I want to do some Christmas cards, and
Nice.
I just want to do decorate my house and do
Right.
on the campus where I live. It's finals week.
Yes.
And as soon as the student's last final is done, they're gone. So it gets quieter and quieter, and it feels like Advent. It feels like I can finally be the contemplative Dominican and not just the active one, because we're supposed to be half and half. And
Do you
I've
know
been,
that you gave me a request to talk with the Holy Spirit on your behalf? I've been doing that.
yeah, you getting some answers?
Well, no, I've asked for you to get the clarity. I didn't ask for him to, I didn't ask for him to give me the clarity.
Yeah, and that's happening. I really do believe that the mission will be well served by uh, having a podcast
Mm-hmm.
and then crafting it, figuring out frequency and all the details about it. And I'm also going to be building a team of people.
Okay, then. Hello, Exploring Consciousness podcast listener. We're going to try again. Good thing I can edit. Hello, Exploring. How are you doing today, Nathan?
Never been better. Take 3.
Okay. Hello, Exploring Consciousness podcast listeners. This is our 3rd installment with Father Nathan Castle. So welcome back to the show, Father Nathan.
Love being with you.
Yeah. So we're in the story phase. We're in number 9 of our PowerPoint, and we're going to be talking about the Wizard of Oz, because you've iterated that you have 2 books. The interrupted. No, you have to tell me.
Afterlife Interrupted. The first one is the subtitle is Helping Stuck Souls Cross Over. And the second one is Afterlife Interrupted, helping souls cross over.
Yeah, instead of it being stuck.
Yeah,
And the
we
and the
we
third
call
one,
it the
but
two.
yeah, and the third one isn't that's not the order that it was in, right? The
No, I
total
wrote my first
first
book
one.
that I ever wrote was called And Toto 2, The Wizard of Oz as a Spiritual Adventure.
I love that. So we're going to talk about the influence of the Wizard of Oz in your life and community. Why is
Yeah.
it a spiritual adventure? But when you told me, if you go down, if you think about it, Dorothy had an NDE, I think I laughed for about the next week. It
Yeah,
was such a delightful thought. So let's go ahead and start with what was the Wizard of Oz? People need to understand our lives. So we're both in our 60s and what that meant when we we had three channels, right? In
yeah,
UHF.
yeah.
So when a movie would come on like The Wizard of Oz, everything stopped. So let's talk about that in your
Sure.
community.
There were no recordings of anything. It was just live broadcast, and you better sit down and watch it while it's on because you won't see it for another year.
A year.
Yeah. Well, anyway, the movie was the book was written in 1900. It was made into the MGM film in 1938 for the 1939 movie year. It was first shown on television the year I was born, 1956. And throughout my childhood, it was played once a year, many times in the springtime at Passover, Eastertide. Uh, so it was placed by these network people, the secular movie, but was placed in a religious season. Um, and when it was promoted for maybe the 2 weeks before it was to be shown on the playground where I was growing up, it was all anybody could talk about. And there was a presumption, it was before there was a Super Bowl, but it was essentially a Super Bowl party. Nobody was going to watch The Wizard of Oz sitting alone in a room. It was going to be a communal event. And where are you going to go and who are you going to be with and what are you going to eat? And it was this whole buzz about watching The Wizard of Oz as a community. And I just thought, as this little Catholic school kid, this is what the gospel is supposed to be doing. Um, the Jesus stories are supposed to be getting everybody focused around a common story and being excited and inclusive and joyful. I wonder why this movie does it. And so, even when I was a little kid, I was already fascinated with the kind of sociological phenomenon of of this particular old movie having such power over people. And they never got tired of it. You know, uh, so anyway, I paid attention to it. One time, Mark Collins was 1 year younger than I was, but we were their family had 11 kids and we had five, so we were this like 101 Dalmatians. We were kids all over the place when we watched The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah,
And I remember,
I'm one of seven, and down the street was a family of 12. So I get it.
yeah, I was hardly ever alone in
No.
childhood. But I remember Judy Garland was on the screen, as Dorothy, and Mark Collins said, she tried to kill herself. And I
Hang
had
on one
no
second.
idea. Okay.
Can you grab cinnamon? Sorry, that's my cinnamon.
Uh,
Okay. All right, let's go ahead. Mark Collins. We'll start again.
yeah, Mark Collins was a year younger than I was. I might have been about 6 or 7. And Judy Garland, as Dorothy, was on the screen, and he said, she tried to kill herself. And I didn't know it. I'd never heard of that before. I'd never heard of suicide. And I pretended in the presence of all these other kids that I was cool. Uh, uh, but I went to bed that night with this little existential crisis because our house had guns in it and knives and, you know, pills and stuff under the sink that had skull and crossbones on it. There were a number of ways that a person could end their life if they were inclined to do that. And I just thought there aren't enough armies or enough police to keep everybody safe from themselves. It just changed my worldview. And then I thought, Judy Garland, she must be the most unhappy person in the world if she thought of doing that to herself. I knew she was still alive because for 1 year in 62, 63, 64 year, she had her own variety show. We hardly ever watched it because it wasn't a children's show and it was on against Bonanza. And
Yeah, Bonanza, forget everybody watched Bonanza.
yeah, and so, but I knew that she was this old lady. I mean, she died when she was 47. So when she was doing that show, she was probably 40, 41. But I knew she wasn't a little girl anymore. She was an old lady that had a TV show. But she had tried to kill herself. And so I thought she must be the world's most unhappy person. So I started praying for her.
Mhm.
Before, and I included her in those night prayers that I mentioned on one of our previous programs. And so I just dedicated, she became the icon of misery for me. And I don't want you to be so unhappy. So I started praying for her, with really focused regularity. Anyway, I watched The Wizard of Oz year after year. And then um, later, many years later, I was in a seminary classroom learning about the Gospels. And for your viewers and listeners, there's four of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. The first one that got written is a short story that involves a road and Jesus going geographically point by point by point toward a city of destiny, Jerusalem, where he's going to be killed and where he's going to then rise. So it's a linear story. And later, the evangelist Matthew took that story, tacked on a prologue and an epilogue, so that the story isn't so much a line anymore as it becomes a circle. It meets back, uh, so that you end up where you began. And as soon as I heard this professor say that, I thought, that's the Wizard of Oz. And later I learned about Joseph Campbell. Do you know his work?
I do.
Maybe
The
you're,
hero's journey.
yeah. He lived for most of the 20th century. He was Roman Catholic, and
Oh, I didn't. That I did not know.
he was Roman Catholic, and he was a daily communicant in his college years in the 19 teens and 20s. But then the Scopes monkey trial was happening in Tennessee about creationism and Darwin, uh, and even though that was really evangelical Christianity that was, behind all that, many of the Catholic bishops in the United States sided with them and were trying to defend the idea that creation was in 7 days and so on. And young Joseph Campbell just looked at that and says, "You people don't even know how to read your own stories. That's not what they're doing. They're a different genre. They're not trying to do science. They're trying to do meaning." And so he ended up leaving the Catholic Church in frustration, and instead he sort of founded a new academic discipline that combined study of mythology, cultural anthropology, some archaeology, and storytelling and meaning, kind of philosophy. So he created his life's work with studying the stories that people across time and space tell about how they got here, what is this place, what's our purpose, and so creation stories in particular, like the two that we have, the 7 day of creation story and the Adam and Eve story. They're really two different stories that get edited together. But then all over the globe, different stories of how we came to be. And then the other kind of story was the epic hero story, the story that tells a person in a particular culture how to be an excellent example of one of us. So like the
And
Iliad, Odyssey kind of story. And
I didn't mean to interrupt, but what we'll do is we'll put on the companion website, we will put the reference to Joseph Campbell's both the hero's story and his mythology, because it's really a large body of work that he did.
and I can send you a couple of handouts that I use when I teach this in a retreat,
Wonderful.
that show it in a circular form and
I
shows
love
the
it.
Wizard of Oz story in a circular form.
And I love that it's a circle, like Oz is a capital O, big circle, and in the etiology of holiness, holy, whole,
Yes.
oneness is a circle. I love that.
Right. Well, when I learned that, I got all the more interested in it. And when I learned about Joseph Campbell, I thought his work, the Oz story, is what he called this the mono myth, that there's this one big story that's operating in the background as these other stories are told in the foreground. Like you and I are on a computer right now, and we're actually using Zoom, but that's in the foreground. But behind it is an operating system that is allowing all this stuff to happen. And that's a way of thinking about the monomyth. It's a story underneath the detailed story that's in the forefront. And when I learned about it, it has somebody minding their own business, some sort of call to adventure, like Moses tending the sheep when he sees this burning bush, hears this voice out of the blue saying, I want you to go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh to stop being bad, let my people go. If he says, he tries to deny the call, you want my brother Aaron, he's the one that talks well. Moses had a speech impediment. Um, and then there's a sense of having to cross a boundary from which there's no turning back. If you accept this call, you'll never be the same. And it might mean leaving where you are and going to an unknown place. That happens to Dorothy in the Oz story because of the tornado. She ends up over the rainbow, no sooner gets there than she wants to go back where she came from, but that's not allowed. You can't go backward, you have to go forward. So if you want to go home, you have to go not backward, but forward. Then in those stories, there's almost always the gathering of allies, the emergence of a nemesis who out of the blue wants to thwart you, moving toward somewhere on a clock face, this would be about 5, 6, 7, some sort of climactic battle that could kill you or kill your companions, some apparent success at that battle, only to find where you're now exhausted, there's even more that has to be done. Life is so like that, just about the time you thought you could cross the finish line, boom, you get cancer or something. There's a next thing, now we got to do this. And then there's that, and then somehow conquering that, and then realizing at about 9 on the clock face that you never really belonged here, you're out of place, and you really somehow need to get back to the place that's native land or home. In order to do that, you're going to have to leave behind all of these people and experiences that have begun to be so important to you. That in The Wizard of Oz, when she realizes the balloon flew off without her. Then Glenda the Good flies in on a bubble and says, you can go home anytime you like. Well, she has to say these teary goodbyes to these friends that she thinks she'll never see again. And then she says, I'm ready, which I believe is the deathbed scene. It's, that's the way it works. You have to, if you have the forewarning, like in hospice care, a lot of goodbye saying is done. And then at some point people say, I'm ready. Or sometimes they're saying, Mama, go ahead, don't stay back, they're ready for you, something like that. Well, there's this spiral thing that in the movie is superimposed over her torso. And then she ends up back in her bed, unable to completely explain herself, like Indy Ears. Well, I got caught in this rope and I was under the water, but there comes a point at which you just give up, she just says, well, that's just it. I was gone for days and days, but they sent me home. Don't you believe me? Yeah, we believe you, honey. Well, no, you don't, but that's okay. You don't, I don't need to be understood. I'm home. And in my little storytelling, Toto, the dog, is the presence of God who was with you always. In your fantasy world, in your real world, it doesn't matter. God will be with you always because God is always everywhere. And so in my story, Toto is the Christ. That's why and not just the Christian Christ, but the universal Christ, the anointed beloved of God.
I like what you said one time when someone had asked you a question about, I asked you earlier in another show that we did about Jesus, and so, or celebrities. And so someone had asked you, well, you speak to when you see Jesus, how does he appear? And I loved your answer about he appears in 2 ways. He can appear as the Jesus that was the God-man, but the Jesus that is in everyone. And I really like that.
Yes, I believe that God is love, and that,
God is
that
love.
Jesus is an incarnation of God as love, and that the person who is most godlike in your life is the person that has loved you with great clarity, where you know that person loved you apart from your merits or demerits or just your being.
Just loving you. Yeah.
Yeah,
I really like that.
yeah.
I really like that about
So that's where the
others.
Oz story came in, and then I did a retreat on it when I was at Arizona State, and I invited my students to spend a weekend with the Oz material and help me to begin putting a book together. And my first book took about 6 years. I was working full time, and I would write on breaks and summers and stuff. And then eventually it made it all the way to publication in 2011.
And people need to know that the work that you've done, and you began talking a little bit about it. When we're recording this, it was a recent devastating tornado in
I was
Mayfield.
hoping you were going to bring that up if you
I
didn't.
am going to bring that up. Do
Yeah.
you want to go ahead and talk about it? You want me to? In
I've
Mayfield?
always had I've had a lifelong interest in healing of trauma.
Yes.
Anytime I haven't really been traumatized. I mean, I've had quiet my own struggles and stuff, but nothing like the trauma that you went through in your NDE. And a lot of people have childhood abuse and all kinds of things that are war, all the PTSD. And anyway, it happened that a few years ago, a horrific tornado went through Joplin, Missouri, and it killed 165 people in about 30 minutes. And uh, I was in charge of all the campus ministries in the country at the time as the executive chair of the Catholic Campus Ministry Association, and I knew my colleague in Joplin, who there's a small state school there, is it southwestern Missouri State or something like that. Anyway, there was a small college that had not been paid attention to until he was assigned to the parish in town, and he made the parish care about the college students, and he built a program. Well, I called him up and said, "Your town has just been through this horror. I wonder if I could help. I have this story about this tornado, and remember, the Holy Spirit is on a mighty wind, and wherever there's darkness, there's light. Maybe I could come and help people process what happened to them, maybe like 9 months to a year afterwards, when there's enough semblance of some new order." So I got to go to Joplin, and it's this town of about 30,000 people. It's in the Bible Belt. There are very few Catholics, but it has a little Catholic high school. It only has 100 students, but it's this sweet little island, and I got to go to this little parish and with this little high school, and what they call the strike zone where the tornado hit. It hit. It was two tornadoes that turned into an F5 right on top of the tallest building in town, which was the Catholic hospital. It was a 6-story building, and it it twisted it and broke all the windows and everything. And people were running toward it because they needed medical care, and people were running out of it because it was this horrific scene. And then it stayed on the ground, and it took out. It was the day of high school graduation at Joplin High School, and people, it just barely missed a stadium full of people. That if it had come 30 minutes earlier, it would have carved right through a stadium full of people graduating. But it was just horrible. So I went there with a little team, and we brought the Wizard of Oz and said, um, "Is there any is there has there been any beauty? Has there been any goodness? Um, is there any sense of coming full circle?" The pastor, who was my friend, said, "My people haven't done a thing in the past year that isn't related to the tornado. Everybody's lives were going along, and people had all kind of plans, and then the tornado struck, and nobody has gotten to do anything in the past year except react to it somehow. And it's time that they get a chance to regroup and have agency in their life again. And could you help us do that?" So we did that, and I was invited back a second time to Joplin, and then a tornado tore through Moore, Oklahoma. Do you remember that one?
Yes, I do.
Moore
Remember,
had
I went to school in West Texas, in Plainview, Texas, at
Mhm.
Wayland Baptist College, and so that's tornado country.
Yeah. Well, Moore had been hit by one already, I think in maybe the late 80s or early 90s. But then it had another one came through, and they knew the day ahead, like the ones that have just happened in Kentucky and Illinois. They knew a day ahead that everything was lining up for what could be a very bad day. And so the people in Moore were all on high alert. Pay attention tomorrow, because this could be a bad day. And it turned out that people had to make decisions that morning about whether to send the kids to school, whether to go into work or take a day off, or, where are we going to, just in case, tornadoes are, they're not very predictable, not like hurricanes are, but they've gotten better at forecasting. So they knew it could be a bad day. And it was the worst, because it hit at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and it took out an entire neighborhood, but it took out an elementary school. And the teachers did what they were supposed to do. They took the children down into the basement underneath the bathrooms. And the bathroom is the part of the building that has the most pipes and sturdiness to it. And so people are often encouraged to shelter in the bathtub or go. And bathrooms don't usually have a lot of glass. You don't put plate glass windows in bathrooms. So you're not around a lot of fine glass. Well, anyway, they did what they were supposed to do. They took the kids down, into the basement below the bathrooms, and then they took a direct hit. It broke all the pipes, it flooded the basement and drowned the kids. And so it was heartbreaking because most of the first responders are people who are at the age when they have small children. And it's like, damn, you did exactly what you were trained to do and thought you were doing the right thing. And then it had this horrible consequence. So the parish there was called St. Andrews. And I just cold called the pastor and said, I have some background in helping people recover from the psychic stuff, the emotional stuff. Would you be interested? And I was able to put him in touch with the other pastor in Joplin, and he could vouch for me. And so we went to more, and we did that a couple of times, and just brought the Wizard of Oz. And I remember being with this sweet kid. He was in the second grade or third grade, and one of his friends had died. And so we were talking about what happens when you die when you're a kid. Do you have to stay a kid? Do you have to be 10 forever? Do you have to wear the same clothes you wore that day? Do you get to grow up? Do you get to imagine what you're going to be when you grow up if you die when you're young? We just ask all these questions. And I brought my niece with me. She had a degree from New York University in educational theater for children. And so she came along, and she had us become tornadoes. We were spinning all over the room and bumping into things. And I don't know, she did a whole lot of games to help children think about goodness and death and recovery from death or afterlife. Anyway, she was just wonderful in that experience. And so were the people. And The Wizard of Oz is such a sweet film that, it's easy to decorate around. If you wanted to have a Wizard of Oz themed birthday party, all you have to do is go online and you can find everything under the sun to decorate for it. And so some of these churches decorate the whole physical plant with Oz stuff, and we have a kind of a festival while we're grieving and thinking about, in the Christian story, Good Friday. Why in the world do we call it good? It's the day that of the crucifixion. But then only 3 days later, we're at the beginning of a new cycle. So I'm just taking that cycle that's embedded in Christian consciousness, and I think in cosmic consciousness, and just using the Wizard of Oz as a way into it. And it's incarnational. If I sing the first 3 notes of any of the songs, people burst into song. Even people that have a hard time imagining God being within them, because for a lot of people, God is out there in the sky, and the sky is where the tornado came from, and it's just all mixed up. But no, Toto is with you, the one who is totality, who's everything. He's been in your arms, and been with you on the journey. So I'm wondering if now I might have an opportunity to go to Mayfield, Kentucky, or was it Edwardsville, Illinois, or anywhere else that people have suffered. It's too early for that yet, but I'm going to at least make some inquiries and say, if there comes a moment when you think it might be appropriate, I have this odd little traveling show, and I'd be happy to bring it to your town.
Yeah, when I heard about Mayfield, I thought of you. I thought, oh, well, I know where he's going. Not
I'd
right
like
away.
to, if I'm invited,
If you're invited, exactly.
That's
But you talk about the power of the story, the myth story, and the power of music and healing, and theater and music. And
yes.
what I think you do the best, Father Nathan, is that you change the perspective, and that's what we do, even in acupuncture, even in healing. So you talked about going within, and people can't see, but that's why I have my medicine bear. Native American stories of healing, and it's about going within and changing your perspective about an event. So yeah, this on this earth we all have our crosses to bear, if you will, and that
Yeah, and one of the things
perspective.
that
I think
saddens me, if I allow myself to get sad by it, is just
no, you gotta.
the low level of discourse. You know, people fighting over politics or fighting over vaccines or fighting over everything under the sun, and my freedoms and restrictions, and people, you know, not wanting to come to Thanksgiving dinner because some family member is going to be there that I'm at odds with. All this fighting, and I see the Oz story, and the people in it are not very similar at all. One's made out of straw and doesn't have a brain, and the next guy's made all of metal and he doesn't have any emotions except he's crying all the time. And a cowardly lion and a little girl and a dog, and you know, some traveling salesman guy, or they're all over the map. But the story binds them all together. And even in the early part of the when they've just met the Scarecrow and the Tin Man, do you remember the Wicked Witch shows up and threatens them all, and then she leaves? She says, "I'm going to burn you up, or I'm going to kill you, or whatever." They say to one another, "Well, I don't even care if I get a heart. I don't even care if I get a brain. I'm going to go with you to help you." And I just like that that natural thing that happens after a disaster, that politicians of different kinds show up on the same stage offering the same kind of help. People that didn't know the neighbor down the street is now taking them in because my house survived and yours didn't. um, in
Yeah,
Joplin.
the healing of trauma is very close to my heart. And you know, you talked about PhDs. Well, my master, one of my, I have two masters. One of my master's thesis is the efficacy of acupuncture on post-traumatic stress.
Oh, yeah.
So it's like, yeah, you know, you people are traumatized, and we need each other. You know,
Yeah,
like you said, we need that traveling group.
I remember one young woman who was, I think, a sophomore in high school, in this little Catholic high school, when the tornado hit. And then in her senior year, she was involved in some academic decathlon that involved going 3 or 4 hours away. She was with all these people from different places. And she had said, "We got so sick and tired of talking about the tornado. When, you know, when you're from Joplin, that's all anybody wants to hear about is the tornado." And then a couple of years after, she went to this decathlon and introduced herself as being from Joplin, and nobody said a word. And then she said, "I wanted them to talk about the tornado." Had they
That's all you
forgotten?
knew.
Like, yeah, she just had they forgotten what
Yeah.
happened to us. And so there came a moment in her life where that was part of her identity now, and she wanted it known that.
Mm,
And this little high school, it existed right against the strike zone.
mm.
There, it missed that high school by a few blocks, but their gymnasium was intact, and the fire station wasn't, and the the civic center wasn't, and the hospital wasn't. So their gym became the triage center, and so all this activity happened right in their high school. So I remember uh, uh, helping them process what was it like for your little gymnasium to become this place. And then all this water showed up from all over the place, and people came from all over the place to take all that pink insulation material was all up in the trees. People climbed
Hmm.
up in the trees to take that down. And they said people came from all over the place, but then they needed to be fed. And so other people gave us food to feed the volunteers. And after a while, there was just this like this great spirit of strangers helping strangers that was it was just a blessing. That was it was one you wish you didn't have to have, but it was goodness, and it needed to be noted.
Do you have a YouTube where you talk about the Wizard of Oz? Do you
Uh,
had a retreat? You give retreats on the? It doesn't always have to be tornado people. You
no,
give
it doesn't. It
retreats
doesn't.
on Wizard of Oz because of the
Yeah, if you go
story.
on my well, first of all, the book is available on Amazon, and it's a paper book, it's a e-reader book, or it's an audio book that I voiced. Um, and then on my website under retreats, there's a tab for retreats. I have about 14 different retreat titles and summaries. I do one along with the 12 steps of AA for moving through your life, whatever it is you're struggles are in your life, using the steps of AA to move out of something confining into something freeing. Geez, I can't. I've done
Well, the
lots.
reason I bring it up is I want people to know it's not just tornadoes. I
Oh,
mean,
not at
you
all.
do a
No.
bunch of work. People need to know your work. And I love that you mentioned your website in that retreat. And so you can go anywhere where you're invited, kind of like your work that you do in the afterlife. You ask about invitations. I would like
Yeah,
people
and
to
if
think about this. Invite,
depending
invite.
upon the pandemic, I'm not getting very many jobs right now that involve being in person because
Because of the
of the
pandemic.
pandemic. People are just people that normally hire folk like me are not wanting to take the risk of lockdowns again or more, that's why I'm on Zoom so much.
I was going to say, we can do this by Zoom.
Yes, and I've done some of that. I have lots of different, like a family of origin retreat. Why is Dorothy an orphan to begin with? We don't know. Where are her parents? Well, she's being raised by an aunt and uncle. So sometimes I'll do family of origin retreats with people to kind of sort through
Yep.
where they came from. I've done some that are particularly for service members, um, because there's also um, fighting in the Wizard of Oz. There's an army of
Battles,
yeah. There's battles and
traumas.
camaraderie. Um, I can't even remember all of them. I have about 14 of them, but you can find them on the website nathan-castle.com under the tab that just says retreats, and then there's a whole page of different Oz related ones.
So I also have on my companion website a Nathan Castle page.
Uh,
So on the companion website, exploreconsciousness.com, about our guests, you
I
can look under
absolutely
that
love
tab.
that material. It's just so flexible. It's so universal that
Yeah.
it can be done in all different ways. And then in the other work that I do, the helping souls. So I prayed to Frank Baum, the author of the
Please
story.
talk about that. Yeah, talk about that whole.
Well, it was his story, and
Mhm.
people use the phrase download now. I think I heard you say
I
a
say
download.
download. I use
People
that
get a
term.
spiritual experience where they feel they're being
Download.
instructed in some way,
Yep.
and it feels like a download. Well, they wouldn't have used that computer metaphor in 1900, but Frank Baum said, of all the stories that I ever wrote, that one was the one that most wrote itself. I felt like I was being dictated to, and I wrote it down. So that story emerged in his consciousness, and I started praying to Frank Baum because I know he's alive. That's the way it works. He died in 1919, but that doesn't mean he's dead. So I started praying to Frank Baum, and he was married for a long time. Uh, he died in 1919, and his wife died in 1955. She was widowed for a very long time. They were very involved in the suffragist movement, trying to get women the right to vote. His mother-in-law was a famous suffragist, and she lived with him. Um, so they were very, engaged in that effort. Um, so I prayed to them, and then I prayed to Louis B. Mayer, head of MGM, and the cast, Judy Garland, and all of them have since passed. So to um, uh, well, Margaret Hamilton has become a friend in this work. She's the Wicked Witch, and she shows up to help people in the that are abused within the movie industry, especially women who were hit on in that Me Too movement stuff. That's this. So anyway, some of the people, Bert Lahr in particular, has become an afterlife friend. He's just this really sweet soul, and they're quite happy to help people when there's a need of it. Um, and they know of my love for them, and they sometimes show up and offer to help me uh, do the crossing work that I'm sometimes called to do.
So I want to also talk about who else you pray for. So it really impressed me that you prayed for even the people that would sweep the sound
Yeah,
stage,
I
the
said,
studio
I know that
people.
some of you sold a button on a costume or you swept the floor of the soundstage. So I included all of them from the bottom up because that's the way that I believe the kingdom of God is built. The last
Exactly,
time.
because we talked about celebrity and people tend to think about the celebrity, but we tend not to think about the people that are sewing the buttons. I love that about you.
Yeah, I always included the whole
Hmm.
group, and I say to them, thank you for what you did because you left a legacy. Stuff that you did all those years ago and were dedicated to doing has blessed me over and over and blessed a lot of other people. And good for you. Thank you for your service, if you will. And
Exactly. So we've talked a little bit about the books, and they're in your website, and so I think we're on number 10 in our PowerPoint. Books, website, and he'll come to give talks. So I want to promote that. A lot
yeah,
of
if
times
anybody's out there, I would love, Judy Garland's 100th birthday is coming up
I was
in
going to say we're about it going into the 100-year cycle, aren't we?
We are her. She was 1 year younger than my parents. My parents both would have turned 100 this year, and Judy's birthday is in early June of 2022. And there's a festival in her hometown of Grand Rapids, Minnesota, that I would love to attend. If anybody's listening anywhere near there, how's a way to get me in?
Guys, you hear him. We need
Yeah,
the invite.
because I would just be this out of the blue weird guy. If there's anybody that can pave the way, I'm thinking even maybe going to that town in a couple of months early or something to help. It might be during Lent or the Easter season for Christian folk, where I do some sort of retreat in this place where these people are probably involved in activities. It's not just that it's her birthday. They do an annual, a lot of places that Judy Garland ever lived, or some towns in Kansas have paved the downtown street when yellow brick and stuff. There are Oz festivals that are kind of all over the place, even cruises that are dedicated to the Wizard of Oz. So it's kind of like Star Trek. There are people that are just Ozophiles but I've never been to any of these things, and it's sort of on my bucket list. I'd like to attend one of these things with my book.
So I'd like to again talk about it's not just Wizard of Oz. I know that's big for you, and the metaphor you use a lot, but I want to go back and talk about like you work with the women that have been abused in the movie industry.
Mm-hmm.
So I have friends that have been abused. It's kind of like the silent trauma where
Yeah.
they feel like what do you say to people that say, this trauma has followed me into my adulthood? That a friend of mine who was an orphan and found their biological parents and all the trauma that was in that life, she feels like it follows her into this life. How would you counsel that group of people that feel like they had childhood abuse and can't get away from it?
Well, delicately, um, and that kind of thing. I would be one little point of light. I'd be,
Yeah.
if people really, if it depends on how long ago their abuse was, what kind of healing that they've undergone in the meanwhile. Um, Sometimes it's forgiveness stuff, even of people that are unrepentant. Forgiving is important. Jesus forgave from the cross without ever anybody saying they were sorry. Forgiveness is just it's just magical if you can, and you can get started even if you can't finish. That doesn't mean you can't start.
I
You can,
love it.
if you can't want to forgive somebody, could you want to forgive them, or could you want to forgive them? uh, could you start where you are, and could you just, and sometimes on retreats I'll do a thing with the Oz material and have people imagine, what was it like the day your birth mother learned she was pregnant with you? What do you know of your birth parents? And for many, that's their natural parents. A lot of us were raised by the people that conceived us. And how old were they? What was their economic status? What was their marriage like? What were their in-laws like? What were their jobs? Was it good news, bad news, indifferent? Um, and then what was it like to be you for the first 5 years? What was it like to be you the first 10 years? And some childhood abuse occurs during that first decade. And uh, sometimes people were disbelieved or could never find the words to even say what was happening to them. Other times they internalize guilt and shame because they were told by an abuser that they wanted this, or they brought it on themselves, and so on. It's multi-layered, but I can come in sometimes and at least uh, help people say out loud, this happened to me, if they need to say that. Or I don't know, just sometimes I can do that as a priest and confidentiality. We're big on confession, and I can say you don't even have to be a Catholic to do that. If you want to tell a story to somebody that you don't want that I promise never to say to anybody else, I know how to do that.
Yeah,
Uh,
you do really well. So do people? So people that listen to this tend to try to contact the people that I've interviewed because they're so touched by what these folks can do. You're not doing any personal counseling anymore? Would you recommend?
I do some. I was just on the phone with
Okay.
a woman in Belgium this morning, right before
Yeah.
you and I
Yeah.
got on this call.
So
Um,
how do they contact? Do you want them to
I
contact you
prefer to
or
be emailed. I
email?
really don't like Facebook Messenger. That's my least
No, no, let's
favorite.
not do that. No, I agree.
So I don't like Facebook Messenger. My that had been hacked a couple of times, and uh, I just ask people if they want me to if they want to reach out to me and would like a reply, go on my website, and in the upper left there's that little envelope thing that you click on that creates an email.
It says
And
contact.
yeah, it's just the email address is info@nathan-castle.com, and I'm on my email most of the day. I'm never very far away from it. And I try to do what I can. I tell people if they're looking for counseling, I'm like the tow truck driver. I can get you out of the ditch, but I'm not going to follow you down the road. You know, if you're really serious about making progress on something that has stymied you, help is nearby. And it's not just some guy that you heard about on a podcast. I can help, but I'm going to get you unstuck if I can, and then ask you to look around for the next team member that can help you make it to the next level.
So we're talking about how someone might become unstuck in this life. What's the greatest lessons that you've learned from people in the afterlife that could help people in this life? Would it be, I know you talked about this is just a subset of people that have been traumatized, but is there something that you recommend? Hey, folks, if you want to not be stuck in when you survive your death, what are the lessons for us now? I
Be
would think
willing.
love and forgiveness, but yeah, I want to hear from you.
One of them would be that's huge is just be willing to think a new thought. And it's difficult when people feel like they've lost hope,
Yeah.
because when hope um, diminishes, creativity diminishes with it. And um, but it's hardly ever totally extinguished. People are not hopeless necessarily any more than the scarecrow was brainless or the tin man was heartless. They had some of it, and the you just need to take a look at what you do have and then use that and then ask for more. What I try not to do is to be like some I've never met a guru, so I only have an idea of what a guru is, and some of my image of that, it might be offensive to gurus, but I don't want to be thought of as some
Yeah.
mystic problem solver that, like that little cartoon of some cross-legged mystic on a mountaintop where people have to climb to ask, for the secrets of the universe. I don't want to do that. I just believe that people have within them or near them what they need, and I might be able to encourage them and help them think a new thought. But I tell them, if you're not ready to move or change, don't contact me, because we'll waste each other's time. If it's in your heart that I'm willing to think a new thought and try a new thing, yeah, then I'd be happy to talk with you. But I've sometimes said to counselees in my life, I can't help you any longer because you don't want to do any of the things that I recommend, which is your perfect right. But let's not waste each other's time. Maybe we meet up at a future time when it's more appropriate. But sometimes people just need to. I'm not good at commiseration. To be miserable with, what that word means. Um,
Yeah, I
there,
love that about you. I love that you said that, and I think that goes back to your joy.
yeah,
I want to be around people with joy. But I like that you change the perspective, even if it's just 1% change in perspective. And I like what you said about if you're not ready to change, because even as acupuncturists, we've had to tell people I no longer can help you because, for this, we almost use the same words that you do.
yeah.
It's like you're
And sometimes
wasting.
you're taking their money.
We're taking
Uh,
their money. I said, you know, you can walk by my clinic and just drop $80 in the door and keep walking. But that's what I feel like we're doing here.
yeah. Well, um, I just this past weekend for Catholic Christians and some of the other liturgical Christian churches uses an Advent wreath,
Yeah.
and it's a circle of green that reminds us that it's evergreen, that life is always green, even in the winter.
Hmm.
Uh, and then it has candles in it, three of which are purple, and one of which is pink colored, rose colored. And that the pink one is it's light in the darkness is the whole theme of it, because Christmas happens near the winter solstice, because we believe that Christ is the light that comes into the darkness. So at the darkest time of the year in the northern hemisphere. Uh, but the pink candle, we lit it this past weekend, and it's in the darkness. You light the pink candle, and it's Gaudete Sunday, which is
Gaudete.
joy. It just
Hmm.
means joy Sunday, and it's not the same joy as Easter, when everything's coming back to life and it's pastel colors and everything in a major key. It's a different kind of joy that happens in the darkness, but you don't need to wait to be joyful. You can be joyful now. Uh, and I ended up talking about music theory and how, well, which is better? Which do you like better, a sunrise or a sunset?
Me personally,
Yeah.
I love them both.
Well, that's exactly
I love them both. I can't pick.
because there's beauty in both.
There's
And
beauty
there
in
are
both.
seasons of life that are like the baptism of a child, and there's another one that's the hospice and the funeral. And you might prefer one to another kind of, but they both can have beauty in them if you're open to what they have to offer. There's a lot of happy reunions that happen at funerals, especially before the pandemic when we had big funerals. um, that's made it harder because people haven't been able to grieve the way that they might have preferred to, with travel being what it is. However, I went into music theory a little bit about, asked people, would you rather hear a song in a major key or a minor
Minor
key?
key. That's a great question.
You know, and a lot of people don't know what a minor key is. They haven't studied music theory, and so
Yeah. The
I
major lift,
sang
the
to them.
minor fall, the major lift.
Yeah, I sang to them my favorite song, which is from The Sound of Music. You would think it'd be The Wizard of Oz, but
Yeah.
it's
Which one
actually
is
The
it?
Sound of Music.
The
My
Hills.
favorite things.
My favorite
My
things.
favorite things. In fact, my favorite things from The Sound of Music has begun to be recorded as a Christmas song.
No,
You sometimes find it on the same playlist
really.
with Santa Claus is Coming to Town.
Oh
Uh,
my goodness.
Years ago, somebody started singing that song and including it
Hmm.
in playlists of Christmas music.
Nice.
But it's written in D sharp minor. It's a very odd key
That's a
for
very
writing,
odd key.
and it's
D
singing
sharp
about
minor.
joyful things, about my favorite things, but it's in a pensive minor key. But it's
In
lovely the way
D.
it goes from it
Huh?
imagines beautiful things, raindrops on roses and whiskers on kittens, but it has these lovely minors in it. These are a few of my favorite things. When the dog bites, when the bee stings, when I'm feeling sad. But then it goes into a major. I simply remember my favorite things, and then I don't feel so bad. It has the cycle of light and darkness in it.
Cycle of life. I love it.
Yes.
Yes.
So
It's an
uh,
Oz. It's an
I
O.
try to help people reimagine what their circumstance is too, even if I sing to them. Could you
Nice.
could you just be where you are and not insist that you be somewhere else, like Dorothy going over the rainbow? Could you just be where you are and receive whatever it can teach you? Um, thank the present moment for whatever blessings there are in it while you tell it goodbye. While you wave goodbye to the past that is burdening you, and say, now it's time for a new season, and I need a new companion. So I'll be the temporary companion, but I'm going to point you towards, there's somebody like Glinda in Munchkinland. She doesn't hang around very long. She gives you the red shoes, and she gives you a kiss that's not hardly even noticed in the movie, but there's a kind of a there's a kind of divine kiss. She's kissed on the forehead
Hmm.
in a kind of a cosmic blessing. And then she's told, how do I get started? Well, it's always best to start at the beginning. Just follow the electric road. So anyway, I feel like it's sometimes I help people in trauma do that. Sometimes people in trauma, if they're really in a loop, like PTSD sufferers,
Yeah.
sometimes they need help that's beyond my pay grade, and I don't attempt to do things that I think are beyond my skill level. I don't think anybody should do that, but that doesn't mean I can't help alongside a skilled practitioner if I'm invited, and sometimes I am. And then I can just help them say, "Can we sing this song? Or can you step out of that loop for a little while?" I've seen this in my afterlife work. Sometimes I'm thinking of a guy who died. He he left the roadway and tumbled down an
Oh
embankment
yeah,
into a
yeah. The
river.
good that yeah.
Um, and but
And
his afterlife consciousness was tumbling, like he was inside a dryer, and he couldn't get out of that. And before he got to me, some people who were helping him in the afterlife, his guardian for one, said, "Let's take a pause from that for just a moment. You know very well how to do that, and you can go back to this anytime you like. But first, let's go do this other thing for a moment." I dealt with somebody that died in the Twin Towers.
mm,
One of the people that leapt out the window, because the way he explained it was, I had the option of breathing in air that was on fire or air that wasn't on fire. That was his moment. And he said, I opted for the air that wasn't on fire, but it was out the window. And he said, in my consciousness, I could fall, but I couldn't land. He said I couldn't allow my consciousness to include landing, but I could let it include falling.
mm,
So his afterlife was this trauma loop of falling. After a while, it becomes your norm. So it's not terror all the time. It just becomes, that's what I do. I fall. You know? You might have known people that had a trauma years ago. They're not exactly reliving it, the terror of it, but they relive the consequences of it somehow. The shutdown that happened
I think
after.
they can live both. I really
Maybe.
do, Nathan. They can. It's in their body.
Yeah.
It's very difficult, even in using acupuncture, to try to break. It's a tough loop to break. I would agree with you on that.
Well, I'm grateful that you bring your expertise and skill to trying to help people do that.
Well,
Um, I,
I'm a healer.
yeah,
I'm a teacher healer.
this one guardian angel was with this guy that was falling, and
Mm.
he fell with him, just kept him company falling because that's what we do. And he fell and
You
fell
know,
and
I
fell.
fell in my near death experience when I was done. When God said, "Well, I'm going to throw you back." It was a falling experience.
Well, this guy was just falling, but I want to let people to know that he wasn't in the afterlife. He wasn't he wasn't terrorized anymore. His
Right. Right.
falling just became a way of being, like
Yeah.
breathing.
Yeah.
And he just fell, that's all. And he didn't allow anything else to happen. He just fell and fell and fell and fell and never landed. And his guardian would fall alongside him and talk to him while they fell. And eventually his guardian said to him, "Could we please for just a minute go up? We're always going down. Could we
Can you,
just stop for just a second? Would you get on my back and we could go up for just a little while? Then we can come back and fall all you like." So his guardian just posed the possibility that, could we just take it like a commercial break? Well, we'll be back after this message. And for a little while, we're just going to go up.
so a
And
lot of times we say, suspend your belief, suspend this thought, just for a minute. You can go back to it, but
precisely.
just for a minute, just suspend it. And
Yeah.
here's a possibility. Let's look at this
And
possibility.
that's the way he described his guardian angel. And he did learn that he did have some agency, he did have some volition, some freedom to choose his consciousness. And he didn't have to choose constant falling. He could choose something else if he wanted to. And once he allowed that into his cognition, he started to want things. And so sometimes people that are in a trauma loop, or it doesn't have to even be a trauma loop, it can just be
Yeah.
a habit
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
thought that saddens a person, like, you know, blaming oneself for something that happened years ago, and insisting that you're never going to let yourself off the hook because of that thing you did. Um,
Well,
well,
I try telling my students, there's two definitions for cognate. One is to think and one is to know.
Oh,
So when you're cognating and you're thinking in this loop, that's one half of the word, and the other half cognate to know that there's another possibility.
yeah.
I always thought that that was a good,
That's wonderful. And sometimes you have to have a little, at least a taste of it, a sample,
yeah, that's
a
it.
little
Just
taste of what the new thing could be. You don't have to go hog wild into it, but you could test your toe in the water. Once dealt in the afterlife with a little kid that was 5 years old when he was abducted
oh
and
my Lord, yeah.
stranger danger. And he had been taught about stranger danger and how to avoid it. But the guy that was the gardener helped him or asked him to help him help get this in the back of the van. It was like a tarp that had grass clippings or something on it. And he didn't know that he was in stranger danger. He thought he was being helpful. And the guy shoved him in the back of the van and wouldn't let him out. And he knew before he was killed that he was an abductee and that he had disobeyed his parents.
Mm.
And uh,
Had
and then
shame.
yeah, and then he was killed.
Mm.
And in the afterlife, he didn't want to go with anybody that was strange to him because he had just done that. And so that was his little dilemma at 5 years old, is that he wouldn't
Oh,
go with
sweetie.
anybody that he didn't know.
Yeah.
And we just I was working with a child psychologist on that one, and
Yeah.
he was as my prayer partner, and he said, well, what if you dipped your toe in the water? Did you ever go swimming but you weren't sure if it was too cold? Could you dip your toe in the water to see if it was okay? Could we do something like that? Could we maybe get you could we bring somebody that you could kind of dip your toe in the water? And the little kid, I remember saying, he was speaking through me, he said, well, you could dip your toe in, or you could sit on the steps. You know, you can lower yourself down on the steps and sit in the water, even if it might be too deep. But,
I like
and so
that.
the little kid had an idea, well, maybe I could sit on the steps. So now we were into this swimming metaphor. And I
Yeah.
said, well, would you mind it if we just say a prayer and ask if God would send somebody safe? Remember, 5 isn't very old, but 5 is still 5. You met lots of people in your 5 years that were kind to you. Not everybody was, hurt you. The last person did, but there were a lot of good people before that. And there are still good people, and maybe some good person would show up if we ask them to, but we'll make them sure they stay far away from you so you can see them from a distance and you can decide whether it's safe or not. So he said, well, we said, do you think it would be okay to try that? We'll stay here with you and we won't let any harm come to you. And he said, okay. So we said a prayer and said, God, would you please send the right person who might be able to help? And he said, I can see her. She's wearing a one piece and a rubber hat. It was a one piece bathing suit and a bathing cap. She's wearing a one piece and a rubber hat. And she's telling me that she's my mom's mom.
Wow.
So great grandma in a bathing
Great.
suit from the 30s or 40s or so 50s, uh, who came for this little guy.
Mm.
And we said, well, now, do you think she's tricking you? Do you think you're safe? And and I said, do you remember the story of Hansel and Gretel? Did anybody ever tell you that story? How you can go for this walk, but you can leave a trail of breadcrumbs
Mm.
behind you. Of course, in that story, the birds ate them.
I was going to say, don't tell him that. Don't tell him that.
Maybe,
Don't
but
tell
it was
him.
that idea anyway that the fact that you leave this safe place doesn't mean that you can't return to it if it's your choice. You're not having to do this frightening once and for all catapult. So anyway, he was willing to allow this lady who was his mom's mom, and off they went. Never heard from him again. Didn't need to. He was able to, re-enter a happy community and not scold himself about what happened to him.
Yeah, I like that you open up the possibilities, and that I love the safety aspect because you're
Yeah.
talking about trauma,
Yes.
and there's safety is gone.
You found a safe place, but it's a lonely place. And
Yeah,
I think you know that it's not really a permanent place because you're not supposed to be lonely
right,
forever.
right.
Do you think it's time to try to find something else? And of course, they don't come to me. They're vetted, and they don't
They're
come to me.
vetted, yes.
Somebody, their guardian or others that have been helping them, thinks that they're closer than they might think. Lots of times that happens. People don't know that they're at the cusp of a breakthrough, but that's sometimes what a clinician does. You can tell because you've got some experience, you can tell that somebody's closer than they know
Oh,
to
yeah.
the progress that you can kind of see before they see it. That's part of what professors do. You can sometimes see potential in a student that they didn't know they had, but you draw it out of them.
Not sometimes, all the
Is
time.
that not sometimes? You do that all the time
All
with
the
your
time.
such a great
All the
professor.
time. If you, after a while, when you have the experience, when you're in the classroom for 30 years, come on, Nathan. It's
Well,
like,
they still have to cooperate. You could have
yes,
somebody
they,
that,
they do. It is all, it's about choice, isn't
yeah,
it?
yeah,
So you try to open up the possibility. And a lot of times, if they come to your office and you're telling them stuff, they just don't believe you.
right.
Like you said, you can, there's a safety here. There's, like you said, it's a counseling thing.
Yeah, and you can say if you can't finish my course this time around, remember I'll be here next semester. I'll
Until I wasn't, but yeah,
until you weren't. Yeah, but
until I
well, you
wasn't.
do what you can, but
Do what you
you
can.
can let people know that you
Yes,
don't have to work on my schedule, maybe on yours.
exactly. Yeah. Well, thank you again, Father Nathan Castle. Outstanding human being doing great work
You're
in
too
the
kind.
universe. We want to thank you. And again, go to the companion website and you can link on his website, or you can go directly to his nathan-castle.com.
Right. And if you want to contact me, please use the website
Use the
and the
website.
email info@nathan-castle.com, and I'll try my best to reply quickly.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.